Hey guys, tonight we're stepping inside the cold stone walls of a medieval monastery to answer a question that sounds simple, but gets weird fast. What did monks actually eat? Picture this: you're standing in a drafty refectory at dawn, your breath visible in the air, surrounded by dozens of silent men in rough wool robes. There's no meat, often no breakfast. Lent means no eggs, no cheese, no fat for weeks. You've taken a vow of poverty, which theoretically means you shouldn't be living better than the starving peasants outside your gates. And yet, somehow monks were healthier, lived longer, and maintained the physical strength to copy manuscripts for 8 hours a day, build cathedrals and brew enough beer to supply half the countryside. You probably won't survive this on modern logic alone, because medieval monastic eating wasn't about meals the way you think of them. It was a spiritual technology, a legal puzzle, and a nutritional high-wire act all at once. The fascinating thing, monks became masters at threading the needle between genuine asceticism and practical survival. They created one of history's most sophisticated food systems while pretending they weren't. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing this little community stretched across time zones, all settling in for the same strange journey through history. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval monastery operated under a fundamental paradox. It existed to reject the physical world, while simultaneously maintaining human bodies in that world for decades. You can't pray effectively if you're too weak to stand. You can't illuminate manuscripts if your hands shake from hunger. You can't maintain a community if half your brothers are dying of scurvy. So the question wasn't really, what did monks eat? It was, how did they eat just enough without crossing the line into gluttony, comfort, or hypocrisy? The answer lies in a system so clever it makes modern meal planning look primitive. Monks didn't just follow rules, they architected an entire food culture around them, exploiting every loophole, technicality, and doctrinal ambiguity they could find. They turned vegetables into complete proteins centuries before nutritional science existed. They classified animals in ways that would make a biologist weep, but a hungry monk rejoice. They built gardens that functioned as both pharmacies and pantries, orchards that produced medicine and calories simultaneously. And they wrote everything down. That's the beautiful part. We have their rules, their letters complaining about the food, their account books listing purchases, their medical texts explaining why certain foods balanced certain humours. We have records of Abbot so-and-so getting in trouble for serving meat on the wrong day, and Brother whoever sneaking extra bread to the novices during a harsh winter. But here's what makes monastic food culture truly fascinating. It was never just about not starving. It was about maintaining a specific kind of body, disciplined but functional, humble, but capable, self-denying but sustainable. The monk's body was a theological statement. What you put into it mattered not just medically, but morally, legally, spiritually. So tonight we're going to walk through a full year in a medieval monastery's food supply, from the daily rhythm of meals to the seasonal cycles of fasting and feasting, from the humble pottage pot that never quite emptied to the elaborate loopholes that made beaver tail count as fish. We'll see how rules written in 6th century Italy got adapted in 13th century England. We'll visit the infirmary where the rules relaxed the guest hall, where they got complicated, and the abbot's private table, where they sometimes disappeared entirely. You'll discover that medieval monks were essentially running the world's first institutional meal prep program, complete with nutrition planning, food preservation, budget management, and quality control. They just did it all, while claiming they didn't really care about food at all, which is possibly the most impressive feat of all. The stone walls are cold. The morning bell hasn't rung yet. You can smell yesterday's bread and the faint, ever-present scent of wood smoke from the kitchen. Your stomach is empty, and it's going to stay that way for hours. But you're not worried because you're part of a system that's been perfecting the art of strategic eating for centuries. Let's begin where everything in monastic life begins, with the rule. The rule of Saint Benedict, written around 530 AD by a Roman nobleman who'd abandoned civilization to live in a cave, became the operational manual for Western monasticism. Chapter 39 and 40 deal specifically with food and drink, and if you read them with a lawyer's eye, you'll notice something interesting. They're remarkably vague. Benedict writes that monks should receive 2 cooked dishes per meal, so that he who cannot eat of one may make his meal of the other. A pound of bread daily, wine in moderation, about a hemina, roughly half a pint, though Benedict admits he wishes they'd drink none at all, and absolutely no meat from 4-footed animals. That's it. That's the entire nutritional framework that governed thousands of monasteries for 1,000 years. You can already see the problem, right? What counts as a dish? Does bread count separately? What about condiments? And that meat restriction. It says 4-footed animals. So 2-footed animals are fine. And what about animals with no feet at all? The genius of medieval monks was recognizing that Benedict had essentially handed them a puzzle with multiple solutions. Different monastic orders, different regions, different centuries, all interpreted these same sentences differently, each convinced they were following the true intent while their neighbours were clearly cheating. The Cistercians prided themselves on stricter observance than the Benedictines. The Cluniacs developed a reputation for, shall we say, generous interpretations. The Carthusians made everyone else look soft. But here's what's fascinating: even the strictest interpretations had to bend towards survival. Benedict himself included an escape clause. Sick monks could eat meat, and the abbot could adjust portions according to the circumstances of the place or the nature of the work. That little phrase, circumstances of the place, opened a canyon of possibility. A monastery in sun-soaked Spain faced different circumstances than one in the frozen Norwegian fjords. Monks clearing forests worked harder than those illuminating manuscripts. Novices grew while elderly brothers withered. So in practice, the rule became a negotiation. You're bound by its spirit, but tasked with keeping your community alive and functional. How do you honour both? First, you get creative with categories. Benedict banned quadrupeds fine. Birds have 2 legs, so poultry enters the menu on feast days. Fish have no legs at all, so they're not just permitted but encouraged for fast days. But then someone notices that beavers spend most of their time in water, and their tails are scaly like fish, and surely anything that lives in water must be aquatic in nature, and therefore, yes, beaver tail is fish, so is barnacle goose, because everyone knows barnacle geese hatch from barnacles attached to driftwood in the sea. We'll come back to that delightful fiction later. Second, you redefine what counts as a meal. Benedict specified 2 dishes at the main meal, but what about the drink that accompanies it? What about the bread? Most monasteries ruled that bread was separate, not one of the 2 dishes, but an automatic addition. Some communities added a 3rd dish on labour-intensive days. The evening collation, originally just a drink and a light reading, gradually accumulated bread, then fruit, then cheese, until it resembled a small meal that definitely wasn't a meal because we're still following the rule, thank you very much. Third, you exploit timing. Benedict's rule required 1 meal per day during winter and 2 during summer, timed to the liturgical hours. But those hours varied by latitude and season. In northern Europe, None. The 9th hour, when the main meal was served, might be mid-afternoon during summer's long days. You could stretch the definition of one meal by making it last 2 hours. Historians still argue whether monks were technically eating one continuous meal or sneaking in multiple courses disguised as a single event. Fourth, you develop a sophisticated understanding of necessity. The rule allowed exceptions for the sick, the very young, the elderly, and those doing heavy labour. But who decides you're sick enough? Often you do. A mild headache might justify a visit to the infirmary where the dietary rules relaxed considerably. We're not talking about faking illness. Medieval monks took their vows seriously, but there was definitely a grey area between robust health and genuine infirmity, where a prudent monk might position himself during a particularly brutal fast, the really clever part. All of this adaptation happened slowly over centuries, with each generation inheriting the previous generation's interpretations and adding their own tiny adjustments. A monastery founded in 650 AD might be serving meals in 1250 AD that Benedict wouldn't recognise, but each individual change had seemed reasonable at the time. It's like that ship of Theseus paradox. If you replace every plank gradually, is it still the same ship? If you adjust every food rule incrementally, are you still following the rule? The answer, most monks settled on, yes, absolutely, we're following the rule more faithfully than those heretics down the road, who interpret it differently than we do. But beneath all the theological gymnastics and legal hair-splitting, there was a practical reality. The rule's vagueness was probably intentional. Benedict was smart enough to know that a rule detailed enough to cover every situation would be impossibly rigid, while a rule vague enough to be flexible would survive across centuries and continents. He gave abbots the authority to adapt, and they used it. So when you sit down to your first monastic meal, understand that every element on your plate represents centuries of negotiation between divine law and human hunger, between the letter of the rule and the spirit of survival. That bread, definitely not one of your two dishes. That fish, absolutely a legitimate Friday food. Don't ask what it tasted like when it had fur. The rule stands. But so do you, still breathing, still functional, still able to pray through the night watches. Benedict would probably approve, even if he'd raise an eyebrow at your definition of fish. Your stomach learns to tell time by bells, not by sunlight. In a medieval monastery, you don't eat when you're hungry. You eat when the liturgical schedule permits, and that schedule was designed by people who believed that physical discomfort brought you closer to God. The architecture of monastic meals wasn't arbitrary. It was a carefully constructed rhythm that synchronized your body's needs with your soul's duties, and if your body occasionally suffered for it, well, that was rather the point. During most of the year, you're looking at 2 meals, dinner after none around mid-afternoon and supper after vespers in early evening. But that's summer. In winter, roughly from September 14th to Easter, you get only 1 meal served after none, which creeps earlier as the days shorten. So in December, you might eat around 2 p.m, and that's it until tomorrow. No breakfast, no snacks, just 1 meal, and whatever your body can extract from yesterday's digestion. Try to imagine that for a moment. You wake at 2 a.m. for matins, chant in a freezing church for an hour, go back to bed until prime at dawn, then proceed through terce and sext, that's 4 services before noon, all on an empty stomach. You're copying manuscripts or hauling firewood or tending the garden, and your last meal was 14 hours ago. Your hands are cold, your concentration wavers. The younger monks look pale, and still hours to go before none. This is where the monastic meal schedule reveals its hidden sophistication, because that single winter meal, when it finally arrives, is substantial. You're not nibbling daintily at a salad. You're consuming enough calories to fuel a full day's labour plus a night of interrupted sleep. The two dishes Benedict prescribed, usually a pottage and a pulse, or vegetable preparation, are dense, heavy, stick-to-your-ribs affairs. The bread is dark, grainy, packed with fibre, and whatever nutrients the medieval milling process didn't strip away. The drink, whether watered wine or ale, adds calories and makes the dry bread edible. Historians still argue whether this meal pattern was healthier or harsher than the peasant norm. Some scholars point out that peasants often ate small amounts throughout the day, a crust at dawn, pottage at midday, leftovers at dusk. Others note that peasants frequently had nothing to eat at all, especially in late winter when stores ran low. The monks' guaranteed daily meal, however, delayed might have been more reliable than anything a serf experienced. But here's what the schedule really did. It created a state of perpetual mild hunger that never quite became starvation. You were always either digesting yesterday's meal, anticipating today's, or in that fuzzy middle state where your body has adjusted to emptiness but hasn't started consuming itself yet. Medieval medical theory, based on those humours we'll discuss later, believed this state was spiritually beneficial. Hunger clarified, thought sharpened, prayer burned away the grosser physical appetites that distracted from contemplation. Modern nutritionists might actually agree with part of that, though they'd use different language. Intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating. The metabolic benefits of occasional caloric restriction, monks were essentially practicing these before anyone had the terminology. Your body adapts, your metabolism adjusts. The initial discomfort fades into a background hum of normalcy. Summer's two-meal pattern offered relief, but introduced new challenges. Dinner still came after none now, perhaps at 3 p.m. Supper followed vespers, maybe around 7 p.m. That sounds civilized until you remember you've been awake since 2 a.m. and working since dawn. 4 hours between meals isn't long, but when you're burning calories in the garden or the workshop, it's not quite enough. You develop strategies, eat slowly, chew thoroughly, drink plenty of ale to stretch that full feeling. The collation became crucial here. Originally just a devotional reading accompanied by a cup of wine or ale, it evolved into a small evening meal for communities that needed it. Some monasteries added bread, some added fruit or cheese, some got creative with drinkable foods, a thick soup that was technically a beverage rite. The rule didn't explicitly forbid the collation, so it existed in that blessed grey area where necessity met interpretation. What's remarkable is how this schedule shaped everything else about monastic life. You planned manual labour around meal times. You assigned lighter tasks to the hours before eating heavier work afterward. You scheduled important decisions for after dinner, when abbots and brothers were less irritable. You never ever held chapter meetings where discipline was enforced on an empty stomach, because hungry monks were quarrelsome monks. The rhythm also created a shared physical experience that unified the community. Everyone's stomach growled during terce. Everyone felt that surge of energy after none. Everyone struggled through compline the final service before bed with a full belly pulling them towards sleep. Your body became synchronized not just with your brother's prayers, but with their digestion, their fatigue, their endurance. And when you broke the rhythm during illness or old age, or as a guest with different requirements, you felt it. The infirmarian might allow you breakfast, and suddenly you're out of sync with the community's metabolic schedule. You're not hungry when they're hungry. You don't share their anticipation or their relief. It's isolating in a way that goes beyond simply eating alone. The meal schedule wasn't cruel exactly. It was designed. Every hunger pang had a purpose. Every delayed gratification built discipline. Every shared meal reinforced community. You learned that your body was a tool, and like any tool, it performed better when used according to its design, even if that design occasionally involved discomfort. The bell for none is ringing. Your stomach knows it before your ears do. You've been waiting, working, praying through the wait. Now you file into the refectory with your brothers, and for the next hour the hunger that's been your companion since yesterday will finally temporarily release its grip. But only temporarily. Tomorrow it all begins again. Bread wasn't just food in a medieval monastery, it was currency medicine theology, and survival compressed into a loaf. You received your daily pound like clockwork, and that pound was calculated with the precision of a pharmacist measuring dosage. Too little and you'd weaken, too much and you'd be indulging in the sin of excess. The monks who ran the bakehouse weren't just bakers. They were engineers of endurance, turning grain into the caloric foundation that made everything else possible. That pound, roughly 450 grams, sounds substantial, until you remember it's often your primary source of calories. On strict fast days, it might be accompanied by nothing but vegetables and water. The bread had to deliver not just energy but staying power, the kind of dense nutrition that would carry you from none to the next day's none without your body cannibalizing itself. So monastic bread was nothing like the fluffy white nonsense you're imagining. This was dark, heavy, whole grain stuff that could double as a weapon if you threw it hard enough. The grain itself tells a story. Wealthy monasteries used wheat which was expensive and produced lighter, more palatable loaves. Poorer communities relied on rye barley or maslin, a mixed grain combination that maximized yield, but produced bread that tasted like what it was desperation baked into edible form. Some monasteries ground their flour coarsely, leaving in all the bran and germ that modern milling removes, which meant more fibre, more B vitamins, more of everything except digestibility. Your stomach worked for every calorie. The baking schedule was relentless. Most monasteries baked twice a week, producing enough loaves to feed dozens or hundreds of mouths. You'd wake at 2 a.m. for matins, and the bakehouse fires were already burning because the bakers had been up since midnight. The smell of baking bread drifted through the cloister at dawn, which was either comforting or torturous, depending on how many hours remained until dinner. Historians still argue whether this timing was practical or subtly sadistic. Nothing sharpens hunger like the scent of bread you can't eat yet. But here's where it gets interesting. Not all bread was created equal, even within the same monastery. The abbot's loaf might be whiter, finer, made from sifted flour. The guests received good bread because hospitality demanded it. The healthy brothers got standard dark loaves. The sick in the infirmary received the Westall bread, a finer, lighter variety, easier on troubled stomachs. And the servants, the lay people who worked in the monastery but weren't monks, often received the coarsest loaves of all, sometimes mixed with bean flour or pea meal to stretch supplies. This stratification wasn't necessarily hypocrisy, though it sometimes was. It reflected medieval medical theory about digestion and humours. Finer foods were believed easier to digest and thus appropriate for weakened bodies or refined spiritual states. Coarser foods suited those engaged in manual labour who needed bulk and were thought to have stronger digestive fires. The abbot bearing the spiritual weight of leadership required lighter sustenance. You hauling stones for the new chapel could handle the heavy stuff. The bread also functioned as a social technology. Your daily allotment was guaranteed, but you could share it, save it, or trade it within informal monastery economies. An elderly monk might pass half his bread to a hungry novice. A brother struggling with a fast might receive an extra portion, quietly slipped from someone else's ration. The cellarer, the monk managing provisions, tracked these exchanges with an accountant's eye, ensuring the system balanced without anyone starving or hoarding. Preservation was an art form. Fresh bread lasted maybe 3 days before turning to stone or sprouting mould. So monasteries developed techniques storing loaves in cool, dry cellars, slicing them thin and rebaking into rusks that lasted months, grinding stale bread into breadcrumbs for thickening pottages and soups. Nothing was wasted. That rock-hard heel from last week became the base for tomorrow's pottage, softened in broth, until it released its trapped calories. Some monasteries even wrote specific bread prayers blessing the loaves as they emerged from ovens. This wasn't superstition, well, not entirely. It was acknowledging that bread represented the thin line between survival and starvation, the daily miracle that kept the community functioning. When crops failed, when stores ran low during a harsh spring, that bread became literally sacred rationed with desperate precision. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Christ called himself the bread of life. The Eucharist transformed bread into divine flesh. Every monastic meal began with a blessing that connected your physical loaf to spiritual sustenance. You chewed slowly, mindfully aware that this dense brown mass represented grain planted and harvested, milled and baked, blessed, and distributed a chain of labour and prayer that stretched from the fields to your mouth. And honestly, it probably tasted pretty good once you got used to it. Your palate adapts. Without sugar, without refined flour, without the hyper-processed flavours that modern taste buds expect, that dark, slightly sour, whole-grain density becomes satisfying. The chew of it, the way it fills your mouth, the subtle, nutty flavour that emerges after prolonged mastication. You learn to appreciate bread for what it is rather than wishing it were something else. Your pound sits before you on the refectory table, a knife nearby, your brothers on either side, each with their own loaf. The reader has begun the mealtime scripture, his voice echoing off stone walls. You break off a piece, dip it in your pottage to soften the crust and chew, slowly, gratefully, aware that this simple act bread-meeting mouth is keeping you alive for another day of prayer and labour. Tomorrow you'll receive another pound, and the day after that, for years, decades, perhaps your entire life. The bread never stops, which means you never stop, which means the monastery never stops, which is exactly how Benedict designed it. Simple, reliable, eternal. Like the bread itself, the pottage pot never truly empties. That's the first thing you need to understand about monastic cooking. Somewhere in the kitchen, probably hanging over a low fire or nestled in coals, there's a cauldron that's been simmering for days, possibly weeks. You add to it constantly vegetable scraps, dried peas, barley herbs from the garden, stale bread, whatever the cellarer distributed that morning. It bubbles away, thickening into a self-perpetuating stew that's different every day but somehow always recognisably itself. This is pottage, and it's the single most important food technology medieval monks possessed. Modern people hear vegetable soup and imagine something thin, watery, maybe a little sad. Monastic pottage was the opposite, a dense stick-to-your-ribs concoction that could sustain heavy labour for hours. The base was usually dried legumes, peas, beans, lentils, chickpeas, depending on region and season. These would simmer until they broke down into a thick puree, releasing starches that gave the whole thing a porridge-like consistency. Then came whatever vegetables were available: onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, parsnips, beets, carrots, if you were lucky. The genius lies in the accidental nutrition. Monks didn't know about amino acids or complete proteins, but they discovered through centuries of trial and error that grains plus legumes kept them stronger than either alone. Barley and the pottage bread on the side together, they provided the protein building blocks your body needed. Add in the vegetables and you've got vitamins, minerals, fibre, all the things that prevent the malnutrition diseases that plagued less systematic eaters. The pot's continuity was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it meant the kitchen never started from scratch. There was always something ready, always calories available if the schedule shifted or if someone needed emergency feeding. Symbolically, it represented community sustenance, an unbroken chain of nourishment stretching backward through time. You ate from the same pot your predecessors fed from, and your successors would eat from it after you were gone. Seasoning was where monasteries revealed their sophistication. You couldn't use expensive imported spices, regularly pepper, cinnamon, cloves were reserved for feast days or the abbot's table. But you could grow herbs, sage thyme, rosemary, parsley, fennel, dill. A handful of fresh or dried herbs could transform bland pottage into something almost pleasurable. Garlic and onions were workhorses, both flavourful and believed to have medicinal properties. Salt, when available, was precious but necessary not just for taste, but for the body's salt requirements during manual labour. Some monasteries developed signature variations. Cistercian pottage reportedly skewed bitter heavy, on the cabbage and turnip reflecting their austere interpretation of the rule. Benedictine versions might be more generous with onions and herbs. Northern European monasteries added root vegetables that stored through winter. Mediterranean communities incorporated olive oil, technically a plant product perfectly acceptable and calorie-dense enough to make up for the absence of animal fat. The texture mattered more than you'd think. Too thin, and it didn't satisfy you'd be hungry again within hours. Too thick, and it became difficult to eat, especially when served lukewarm, which it often was by the time you reached it in the refectory. The ideal consistency was somewhere between soup and porridge, thick enough to cling to your bread when you dipped it, thin enough to swallow without choking. Historians still argue about portion sizes. The rule's 2 dishes probably meant 2 servings of different preparations, not 2 dainty spoonfuls. Evidence from monastic account books suggests generous quantities enough to fill a grown man who'd been working since dawn. You weren't meant to leave hungry, just not stuffed to the point of drowsiness. The goal was functional satiety, fed enough to work, not so much that you'd skip none in favour of a nap. The eternal pot also served as quality control. If ingredients spoiled, not unusual in an era without refrigeration, the damage was diluted across the entire batch, rather than concentrated in one ruined meal. A few questionable turnips disappeared into the communal cauldron, cooked thoroughly enough to kill most pathogens masked by stronger flavours. This wasn't negligence. It was efficiency in an environment where wasting food could mean someone going hungry. Different seasons produced different pottages, creating a calendar you could taste. Spring brought fresh greens, nettles, sorrel young onions that added brightness after winter's monotony. Summer meant variety peas, beans, carrots, beets, herbs at their peak. Autumn was the harvest celebration, fresh from the fields, everything abundant, the pot practically overflowing. Winter turned darker, dried legumes, root vegetables from storage, fewer herbs, the pot becoming heavier, denser, more monotonous as stores depleted. The kitchen brothers who tended these pots were specialists, though. That word doesn't quite capture it. They weren't chefs pursuing culinary art, they were maintaining a machine that converted raw ingredients into human endurance. They knew by sight when the consistency was right, by smell, when more herbs were needed, by taste, when the salt balance had shifted. This knowledge was passed down through observation and practice, rarely written, because you learned it by doing, by stirring, by tasting a spoonful and deciding what tomorrow's pot needed. And here's the thing that might surprise you: after weeks of eating pottage twice daily, you stopped noticing what you'd initially perceived as blandness. Your palate recalibrated. These subtle differences between Monday's turnip-heavy batch and Wednesday's pea-based version became meaningful, even enjoyable. You looked forward to the days when the cook added extra onions or when fresh herbs appeared. Deprivation makes small pleasures enormous. You lift your wooden bowl. Steam rises, carrying the scent of thyme and long-cooked vegetables. The pottage is brown, green, thick flecked with barley and bean skins. You dip your bread, which softens and absorbs the broth. The first bite is hot, earthy, more satisfying than it has any right to be. Your stomach, empty since yesterday, accepts it gratefully. Somewhere in the kitchen they're already adding tomorrow's ingredients to what remains. The pot never empties. Neither does your hunger, not completely. But for this moment at least it quiets. Now we arrive at one of medieval Christianity's most entertaining intellectual achievements, the systematic reclassification of animals to make forbidden foods permissible. You're a monk bound by rules against eating four-footed beasts, but you're also a human being with a body that occasionally craves something beyond pottage and bread. So what do? You don't break the rules. You redefine reality itself until the rules say what you need them to say. The fish exemption was legitimate and straightforward. Benedict's rule permitted fish. The early church permitted fish. Everyone agreed fish were acceptable fast-day food. Fish had no legs, lived in water, were cold-blooded, clearly a different category from land animals. Monks living near rivers, lakes or coasts had ready access to protein that satisfied both law and appetite. Coastal monasteries developed sophisticated fishing operations. Inland communities dug fish ponds, stocked them with carp or pike and harvested them on Fridays. But then someone looked at a beaver. Beavers spent most of their time in water. Their tails were scaly, flat, almost fin-like. They swam. Therefore, by a logic that would make a medieval scholastic proud and a modern biologist weep, beavers were aquatic creatures. Specifically, the tail was aquatic, the rest of the beaver remained problematically furry and four-footed. But the tail, that was clearly fish. Monasteries in regions with beaver populations began serving beaver tail on fast days, and apparently no one's conscience troubled them too much about it. The barnacle goose took this reasoning to magnificent extremes. These geese appeared in northern Europe during winter migrations, but no one had ever seen their nests or eggs. Where did they come from? The prevailing theory, and I'm not making this up, was that they hatched from barnacles attached to driftwood in the sea. Since they came from the sea from barnacles which were shellfish which were permissibly aquatic, then barnacle geese were obviously not birds but sea creatures, therefore edible on fast days. Historians still argue about whether monks actually believed this, or whether everyone winked at the obvious fiction, because roasted goose was delicious and the winters were long. Written records show serious theological debates about barnacle geese classification. Popes weighed in. Some monasteries accepted the aquatic classification, others rejected it as sophistry. The fact that the debate happened at all tells you something about medieval Christianity's relationship with both rules and appetite. Puffins got similar treatment in coastal regions. They lived on cliffs, spent time in water, ate fish, clearly more aquatic than terrestrial right. Some monasteries added them to the acceptable list. Same with certain waterfowl whose habits seemed fishy enough to justify consumption. The criteria became increasingly creative. Does it swim more than it walks? Does it taste fishy? Does it live near water? Can we make an argument that wouldn't immediately get us excommunicated? Then there's the whole category of amphibians. Frogs definitely lived in water. And their legs, while technically, legs were more like flippers, weren't they? Some French monasteries developed quite sophisticated frog cuisinettes, which probably explains certain aspects of French cuisine's later development. Turtles were borderline acceptable. Eels were enthusiastically embraced fish-like shape water-dwelling, no question about their status. The really fascinating part is how seriously monks took these classifications. They weren't just making excuses, they were constructing elaborate theological and natural philosophical frameworks to justify their conclusions. Medieval bestiaries classified animals by their properties and habitats, and if you classified carefully enough, you could make a reasonable argument that many creatures existed in categorical grey zones. The universe wasn't cleanly divided into permitted and forbidden. It was full of ambiguous cases requiring scholarly interpretation. Birds presented a special category. The rule didn't explicitly forbid birds, only quadrupeds. So poultry, chickens, geese, ducks appeared on feast day tables without controversy. But were they truly in the spirit of monastic poverty? Some stricter orders banned them anyway. Others embraced them enthusiastically. Eggs from these birds created their own debates. Were they meat-adjacent? Did they count as animal products during strict fasts? Different communities reached different conclusions, each convinced of their correctness. The dolphin and porpoise situation gets wonderfully absurd. Both were occasionally caught in fishing nets or washed ashore. They looked like fish. They lived in water. They had fins. Never mind that they breathed air, were warm-blooded, and nursed their young medieval naturalists didn't know or didn't care about those details. If it swam and could be caught by fishermen, it was fish enough. Monasteries in fishing regions would trade for dolphin meat, considering themselves fortunate to have such substantial fish available. What's remarkable is that these classifications, once established, became defended with genuine intellectual rigour. Monks would cite authorities, Isidore of Seville's etymologies, various church fathers, local bishops, previous abbots. They'd build arguments based on Aristotelian categories, theological principles, and natural observation. The goal wasn't to cheat, but to understand God's creation correctly. And if that understanding happened to align with your culinary preferences, well, surely that was divine providence. Some monasteries rejected the whole game as legalistic nonsense. The Carthusians, for instance, generally refused even legitimate fish, considering the entire what counts as fish debate a distraction from true asceticism. Other communities embraced the intellectual challenge, producing treatises on animal classification that influence later natural history. The modern observer wants to laugh, but there's something almost admirable about the dedication to rule-following combined with creative interpretation. Medieval monks didn't say, "The rule is stupid, let's ignore it." They said, "The rule is sacred, let's understand it so thoroughly that we can navigate its boundaries with precision." The fact that this navigation sometimes led to beaver tails and barnacle geese is just evidence of human ingenuity meeting human appetite. You're sitting in the refectory on a Friday in November. It's a fast day, so no meat. But there's fish today, except it's beaver tail roasted, seasoned with herbs distributed to each brother. It tastes like dark meat, slightly gamey, nothing like cod or herring. You chew slowly, aware that you're eating something that required centuries of theological debate to reach your plate. Is it fish? By medieval standards, absolutely. By any other standard, obviously not. But the important thing isn't the biology, it's that you're following the rule while still receiving the nutrition your body needs. The spirit and the letter are both satisfied, even if they required a slight redefinition of aquatic life to get there. God, you suspect, has a sense of humour about these things. Step outside the refectory walls and into the cloister garden, and you're entering what amounts to a medieval pharmacy/grocery store designed with the precision of a chessboard. Every plant has a purpose, often multiple purposes, and the monks who tend these beds aren't just gardeners. They're managing a living system that provides food, medicine, seasoning, preservation agents, and occasionally the raw materials for mild intoxication when the infirmarian needs a painkiller. The garden layout follows a logic that would make a modern permaculturist nod in approval. raised beds often arranged in a cross pattern that doubles as devotional symbolism, paths between them for access and drainage, taller plants on the north side so they don't shade smaller herbs, companion planting before anyone called it that, onions near carrots to confuse pests, beans to fix nitrogen in soil fennel kept separate because it doesn't play well with others. You've got your culinary section, onions, leeks, garlic, forming the aromatic base of every pottage, cabbage, kale and other brassicas that survive frost and provide greens through winter, root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, beets, skirret that store in cellars for months. Peas and beans trained up trellises their flowers pretty enough to justify including in a space devoted to prayer, but practical enough to provide protein when dried. Then the herb section, which is where food and medicine blur into one category. Sage for digestion and preservation. It slows spoilage in stored meats when you have them, and settles upset stomachs. Thyme, which flavours pottage, but also treats respiratory ailments. Rosemary for memory and clarity of thought. Plus, it makes roasted vegetables less boring. Parsley chewed after meals to freshen breath, important when you're chanting, in close proximity to dozens of brothers who've eaten the same garlic-heavy pottage. Fennel deserves special mention. The seeds flavour bread and fish. The fronds add anise notes to dishes, but more importantly, fennel was believed to suppress appetite, which made it valuable during long fasts. Historians still argue whether this was placebo or whether fennel genuinely affected hunger signals, but medieval monks swore by it. A handful of fennel seeds before none could make the wait until dinner more bearable. The medicinal section operated on humoral theory, the idea that health meant balancing 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Different herbs corrected different imbalances: feverfew for hot conditions, as the name suggests, horehound for cold phlegmy ailments, rue for digestive troubles, wormwood for parasites which were nearly universal, mugwort for women's complaints. Though monasteries rarely housed women, they kept it anyway for the lay people who worked there and for trade. Garlic was practically holy. It appeared in both food and medicine with such frequency that some monasteries smelled perpetually of it. Garlic pottage for health maintenance, garlic poultices for infections, garlic-infused wine for digestive troubles, raw garlic chewed for respiratory ailments. The fact that it also made food taste better was almost secondary to its medicinal reputation, though no one complained about the flavour improvement. Fruits occupied their own section, often along walls where they could be trained upward. Apple and pear trees if space permitted. Grapevines in warmer regions, remember you need those for wine, which isn't just drink but daily nutrition. Berry bushes, raspberries, blackberries, gooseberries, whatever suited the climate. These provided fresh fruit during their season and could be dried or preserved in honey for winter. The preservation aspect was crucial. Many herbs served as natural antimicrobials. Sage, thyme and rosemary in stored grains discouraged mold and insects. Onions and garlic in the storage cellar slowed spoilage. Certain plants repelled rodents, mint, tansy, wormwood placed strategically around food stores. The garden wasn't just producing food, it was protecting food already produced. Crop rotation was practiced, though not necessarily understood. Monks noticed that fields planted continuously with one crop weakened, but alternating crops maintained productivity. They didn't know about nitrogen fixation, but they observed that planting beans one year improved the next year's cabbage. This empirical knowledge accumulated across generations, written into practical guides that modern agricultural historians study with respect. The timing of planting and harvest followed both lunar cycles and liturgical calendar. Certain seeds went in on specific feast days. harvests aligned with prayer cycles when possible. This wasn't superstition, well, not entirely. It was a mnemonic system that ensured tasks happened at optimal times without requiring written schedules. Everyone knew you planted onions after the feast of St. Benedict harvested apples around Michaelmas. Some monasteries developed specializations. Certain German monasteries became famous for hops cultivation necessary for beer brewing, which we'll discuss later. French houses perfected wine grapes. English monasteries in Romney Marsh grew exceptional cabbages in the rich salt marsh soil. These specialties became trade goods, allowing monasteries to exchange their surplus for things they couldn't grow. The garden also served contemplative purposes. Manual labour in the garden was considered spiritually beneficial. It kept hands busy, prevented idleness, connected you to creation. The repetitive nature of weeding, pruning, harvesting allowed for prayer-like meditation. Many monks reported their clearest spiritual insights came while tending beans or pulling turnips. Water management was critical. Most monasteries were built near streams or springs for a reason. Elaborate systems of channels, drains, and cisterns kept gardens irrigated. Some houses built water-powered mills to grind grain. The flowing water symbolized spiritual purity while serving practical needs. There's that medieval Catholic genius for making everything mean something, while also being useful. The garden's yield supplemented the pottage pot directly. The cook didn't plan meals and then gather ingredients. He looked at what the garden produced that day and built meals around it. Late summer meant beans and cabbages featured heavily. Early spring brought nettles and sorrel. Deep winter relied on stored roots and dried herbs. You ate seasonally because you had no choice, which meant your diet varied across the year, even if every meal was technically pottage. You're kneeling in the herb bed pulling weeds from around the sage. Your hands smell of earth and crushed thyme where you accidentally brushed against it. The sun is warm on your back, rare enough in this climate to feel like a blessing. Around you, brothers tend other beds, one thinning carrots, another checking the onions for disease, a third harvesting parsley for tonight's meal. This garden will feed you today and heal you tomorrow. Its rhythms are slower than the liturgical hours, but just as reliable. Seeds become plants, become food, become energy, become prayer, become new seeds. The cycle never breaks. Neither do you as long as the garden keeps producing. Which it does. Year after year, season after season, like clockwork, like prayer, like breath. Dairy occupies one of the most contentious positions in monastic food culture, neither clearly forbidden nor unambiguously permitted, and subject to interpretation that shifted by century region and how strictly your particular abbot felt about things that morning. Cheese, eggs, butter, milk, all products from animals, but not the animals themselves. Where exactly do they fit in a diet designed to mortify the flesh without actually destroying the body? The early rule made no explicit mention of dairy. Benedict wrote about bread, vegetables, fruit, fish, and wine. Eggs and cheese appear nowhere, which created centuries of debate. Was the omission intentional, meaning they were forbidden? Or was it simply that Benedict assumed everyone understood these fell into an acceptable middle category? Different monastic orders reached opposite conclusions with equal conviction. The strictest interpretation held that dairy was too rich, too indulgent, too connected to the animal flesh it came from. If you couldn't eat the cow, should you really be consuming what the cow produced? The Carthusians generally avoided dairy altogether except during illness. The Cistercians waffled, some houses forbade it. Others allowed cheese but not butter, creating distinctions that seem arbitrary until you understand the underlying logic about degrees of removal from the animal. But here's the practical problem in Northern Europe, especially surviving winter without dairy. was genuinely difficult. Cheese stores for months without spoiling, it's basically preserved milk shelf-stable protein that requires no cooking. Eggs provide complete protein, vitamins and fat in a tidy package. Butter, while clearly indulgent, makes edible those dry roots and boiled vegetables that otherwise taste like penance itself. A monastery trying to follow strict dairy prohibition in Scandinavia or northern England faced malnutrition issues that didn't arise in sunny Italy, where Benedict wrote his rule. So accommodations emerged. Cheese became acceptable in most communities, especially hard cheeses that had been aged. The aging process somehow made them less sinfully fresh. Soft cheeses faced more suspicion, probably because they tasted better. Eggs gradually entered the diet, though some houses restricted them during Lent and Advent. Butter remained controversial, clearly fatty, clearly rich, obviously delicious, therefore probably problematic. The seasonal rhythm added complexity. During Lent, even communities that normally allowed dairy often forbade it. 40 days without eggs, cheese or butter, subsisting on bread, vegetables, dried fish and prayer. Your body noticed. The first cheese after Easter reportedly tasted better than anything you'd ever experienced, which would probably part of the point make the deprivation real enough that the feast day felt like genuine celebration. Eggs created their own category of complications. Were they meat? They came from birds which were acceptable when the birds themselves were eaten on feast days. But an egg was a potential chicken containing the essence of future flesh. Some theologians argued eggs were proto-meat and therefore forbidden during fasts. Others countered that an unfertilized egg was just an egg. Monasteries with chickens had to navigate these debates while also dealing with the practical reality that chickens lay eggs regardless of theological positions. The solution often involved creative timing. Eggs laid during Lent couldn't be eaten during Lent, but they could be preserved packed in salt, buried in ash, sealed with wax, and consumed after Easter. Some monasteries developed elaborate egg preservation techniques that allowed them to stockpile protein for lean times. The chickens, oblivious to liturgical calendars, kept laying. The monks, trying to honour both rules and biology, got creative with storage. Cheese production was an art. Most monasteries with livestock made their own developing regional styles. Hard mountain cheeses that survived months of storage. Soft valley cheeses consumed within days, aged cheeses that grew sharper and more complex over time. The cellarer monitored cheese stores like a banker watching gold reserves. This was valuable, tradable, nutritionally critical inventory. Some monasteries became famous for their cheeses. Certain French houses developed techniques that evolved into cheeses still produced today, Maroilles Munster, Port Salut, Epoisses. These weren't accidents. They were the result of centuries of monks experimenting with cultures, aging conditions and techniques, passing knowledge through generations. The fact that some of this cheese-making happened in the grey zone of should we even be eating this makes the dedication more impressive. Butter faced the harshest restrictions. It was clearly luxury, smooth, rich, flavourful, everything poverty and simplicity opposed. Many communities banned it entirely. Others allowed it for the sick, the elderly, or during extremely cold weather when extra fat helped maintain body heat. Some German and Scandinavian monasteries negotiated butter dispensations, with their bishops arguing that northern climates required different standards than Mediterranean ones. These dispensations sometimes required payment, essentially buying permission to use butter during fasts. The money funded church projects so everyone could feel good about the arrangement. You paid for your butter, the cathedral got a new window. God presumably approved of both outcomes. Historians still argue whether this system was pragmatic flexibility or early indulgence selling that prefigured larger corruption. The infirmary maintained separate dairy standards. Sick monks received eggs, milk, cheese, sometimes butter, regardless of the season or fast day. Illness trumped dietary law. Your body needed repair, and dairy provided concentrated nutrition that vegetables alone couldn't match. This created a perverse incentive to claim illness during harsh fasts, which the infirmarian policed with varying degrees of skepticism. Milk itself was rare in most monastic diets. It spoiled quickly, and drinking fresh milk was considered somewhat childish, appropriate for the young but not for adult men. Most milk became cheese butter or whey. The whey, the liquid left after cheese making, was often fed to pigs or used in bread making. Nothing wasted, everything utilised. What's fascinating is how these dairy debates never fully resolved. Even at the end of the medieval period, monasteries disagreed about egg and cheese permissibility. Some had moved toward accepting them universally. Others maintained strict prohibitions. The middle path, allowing dairy except during major fasts, probably predominated, but uniformity never emerged. You're sitting at dinner on an ordinary Wednesday in July. Before you is your bread, your pottage, and because it's summer and not a fast day, a small piece of cheese, hard-aged, sharp enough to make your mouth water. You eat it slowly in tiny bites, making it last. It's probably not sinful. Your abbot permits it. But centuries of debate about this exact piece of cheese echo in the background every time you chew. Is it humble enough? Is it simple enough? Is it keeping you fed without making you comfortable? You don't know. Nobody entirely knows. But your body, pragmatic and unconcerned with theology, accepts the protein gratefully and gets on with the business of keeping you alive. Which is ultimately the point. Lent arrives like a cold front, and suddenly the already restricted monastic diet contracts to something that tests the absolute limits of human endurance. 40 days, technically 46, if you count Sundays though. Sundays technically don't count as fast days, which is its own theological puzzle of the most austere eating you'll experience all year. No meat, obviously, but also no eggs, no cheese, no dairy of any kind. No wine in most communities, just water or weak ale. Often just one meal per day served late afternoon, and that meal bread, vegetables, dried fish if you're fortunate, salt if you're blessed. You need to understand that Lent doesn't arrive randomly. It lands at the absolute worst moment of the medieval food calendar, late winter and early spring, when stored provisions are running low, when nothing fresh grows, yet when your body's already depleted from months of cold and limited variety. This isn't coincidental. The Church scheduled the harshest fast during the harshest season, compounding physical deprivation with spiritual discipline. You're not just giving up indulgence, you're fighting genuine hunger in a body already weakened by winter. The first week is hardest. Your body expects eggs at breakfast, except there's no breakfast. It anticipates cheese with dinner denied. The pottage tastes flatter without any dairy to enrich it. Your stomach growls louder, adjusts slower. You feel light-headed during sext, unfocused during manual labour. The younger monks look pale. The older ones move more carefully, conserving energy that suddenly feels scarce. By the second week, something shifts. Historians still argue whether this is metabolic adaptation or psychological resignation, but the acute hunger dulls into a constant low-grade awareness of emptiness. You're not starving. The meal you do receive contains enough calories to prevent actual starvation, but you're operating in permanent deficit. Your body burns through stored fat. Your face thins. Your ribs become visible. Everyone in the refectory looks gaunt together, which somehow makes it bearable. The menu during Lent achieves impressive monotony. Pottage without eggs or cheese to enrich it. Bread darker and coarser than usual because finer flour feels too indulgent. Dried fish, cod, herring. Whatever was salted and stored from last year's catch served perhaps 3 times weekly. Vegetables from storage, turnips, onions, the last withered carrots, cabbage that's seen better months. Dried peas and beans become your primary protein, prepared the same way day after day because there aren't other options. Some monasteries added specific Lenten traditions. Salted herring every Friday, so ubiquitous that you can taste it in your sleep. Pea soup thick enough to stand a spoon in, served cold, because the kitchen fires are kept low to save fuel. Bread soaked in water with a bit of salt, not even dignified pottage. Just softened bread that fills space in your stomach without requiring cooking fuel. The absence of wine hits harder than you'd expect. That daily hemina wasn't just pleasure, it was calories. Vitamins from the grapes, a mild analgesic that made aches and cold more tolerable. Water or weak ale doesn't substitute. You feel the loss not just in taste, but in energy. Some monasteries allowed ale during Lent, reasoning it was liquid bread rather than luxury. Others forbade even that, leaving only water. 40 days of water in a climate where water often tastes of iron and earth. Medical consequences were real. Vitamin deficiencies accumulated. Scurvy began to creep in bleeding gums, weakness slow healing wounds, anemia from iron deficiency, weight loss that sometimes crossed from disciplinary to dangerous. The infirmary filled with brothers genuinely sick, not malingering. The infirmarian made difficult decisions about who was sick enough to receive eggs or cheese, knowing that relaxing standards would flood him with requests, but that withholding could cause real harm. The elderly suffered most visibly. An old monk's body couldn't recover from deprivation the way a young one could. You'd watch brother so-and-so who'd survived 40 previous Lent struggle through his 41st. Sometimes they didn't survive. Lenten deaths were common enough that the infirmarian expected them. They'd weaken during the fast, catch some illness their depleted body couldn't fight and die just before Easter. The timing felt cruel, but perhaps they considered it holy dying during the Church's season of death and resurrection. Children and novices received some accommodation. The rule recognized that growing bodies needed more. They might receive a small breakfast, just bread and water, nothing indulgent, but something to fuel growth. They might get slightly larger portions at dinner, but they still fasted by adult standards, and you'd see teenage boys go from robust to hollow-cheeked over 40 days. The psychological component rivaled the physical. You're not just hungry, you're watching everyone around you. Hunger together, creating a shared misery that's bonding and alienating simultaneously. You're all suffering, but you can't discuss it, because complaining about assigned penance suggests weak faith. So you suffer silently aware that the brother beside you is suffering identically, unable to acknowledge it, except through stolen glances of shared exhaustion. Sleep becomes difficult. You're cold. Lent spans late winter and hungry, and those conditions don't promote rest. You wake multiple times per night, stomach cramping. The 2 a.m. bell for matins feels more brutal when you're already sleep-deprived and undernourished. You stumble through prayers in a fog of fatigue and calorie deficit. Some brothers reported spiritual breakthroughs during Lent, moments of clarity or divine presence that seemed to arrive through the emptiness. Mystics wrote about achieving heightened states during fasts. Whether this was genuine spiritual experience or just hunger-induced altered consciousness, historians still argue. Probably both. An empty stomach does change consciousness, and if you interpret those changes through a religious framework, they become religious experiences. The countdown to Easter became obsessive, though no one admitted it. You knew exactly how many days remained. You fantasized about the Easter feast: eggs, cheese, wine, possibly meat depending on your order's standards. That first meal after Lent took on almost mythical proportions in your imagination. Would cheese ever taste that good again? Would wine ever feel that sustaining? But here's the strange part. By the 4th or 5th week, some monks found themselves almost comfortable in the deprivation. The body had fully adapted. The hunger was familiar. The simplicity of the restricted diet removed decisions and variations. You ate what you were served, no choices, no complexity. There was a kind of peace in that, a surrender to the season's demands. Advent brought a second shorter fast, 4 weeks, instead of 6 slightly less severe but still substantial deprivation during another cold, dark season. 2 major fasts per year plus various minor fast days and vigils. Add it up and you're spending roughly a quarter of the year in deliberate nutritional deficit. You're in your 3rd week of Lent. The pea pottage before you looks and tastes identical to yesterday's, and tomorrow's will be identical to today's. Your bread is heavy, dense, requires aggressive chewing. No cheese, no eggs, no wine. Just this and water and the knowledge that you've got 2.5 more weeks of this stretching ahead. Your stomach has stopped growling. You're past that. Now it's just a hollow feeling, a constant awareness of emptiness that's become your baseline. You eat mechanically, chewing slowly, not from mindfulness, but from the awareness that eating slowly makes the meal last longer, occupies more time, creates the illusion of abundance. Around you, your brothers do the same. Hollow cheeks, deliberate movements. The refectory is quieter than usual. Speaking requires energy nobody wants to spare. You're all enduring together separately, each alone with an identical hunger. Easter will come. It always does. But right now, Easter feels impossibly distant, and the pottage in your bowl is your entire reality. Beer wasn't a luxury in medieval monasteries. It was survival technology, disguised as a beverage. You drank it at breakfast if you had breakfast with dinner, certainly possibly at supper, and the reasoning was both practical and nutritional. Water could kill you. Wells could be contaminated. Rivers carried diseases. But beer fermented and boiled was safe. The alcohol level was low, maybe 2-3%, but enough to suppress pathogens. More importantly, a beer was liquid bread packed with calories and nutrients your body desperately needed. The phrase liquid bread wasn't poetic exaggeration. Monastic beer was thick, cloudy, substantial. You could almost chew it. The brewing process extracted nutrients from grain, B vitamins, minerals, proteins, and suspended them in drinkable form. A large mug of monastery ale could contain 200 to 300 calories, plus thiamine, niacin, riboflavin. All those things that prevented the nutritional deficiency diseases that plagued populations relying on grain alone. Every substantial monastery brewed its own beer. The brewhouse was as essential as the kitchen, sometimes more so. Brewing happened continuously. Beer didn't store indefinitely, so you needed constant production to maintain supply. The brother assigned to brewing wasn't doing menial work. He was maintaining the community's health and hydration. Get the brewing wrong and people got sick. Get it right and you had safe drinking supply for months. The brewing process was more complex than you'd think. You started with grain barley, primarily, though wheat oats or mixed grains worked, depending on what the monastery grew or could afford. The grain was malted, soaked, allowed to sprout, then dried in a kiln. Sprouting converted starches to sugars. Drying stopped the process and added flavour. The degree of drying affected the beer's colour and taste longer. Kilning produced darker, more robust flavours. Mashing came next. Crushed malted grain steeped in hot water, enzymatically converting remaining starches to fermentable sugars. The resulting liquid wort was drained off, leaving spent grain that went to pigs or cattle. Nothing wasted. The wort was boiled traditionally with grut, a mixture of herbs that added flavour and preservative qualities, before hops became standard. Yarrow mugwort, wild rosemary, whatever grew locally, and added bitterness to balance the malt's sweetness. Hops entered European brewing, gradually revolutionizing the process. Hops were better preservatives than gruit, extending beer's shelf life significantly. They added pleasant bitterness and aroma, and conveniently they grew well in monastery gardens. By the 12th century, hopped beer was spreading from German monasteries throughout Europe. Some houses specialized in hop cultivation, developing varieties and techniques that influenced later commercial brewing. Fermentation was the magical part, though they didn't understand it as magic. They understood it as God's transformation of grain into something wholesome. Wild yeast from the air from wooden vessels from previous batches worked on the sugars producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. The process took days or weeks depending on temperature and yeast vigor. The brewmaster monitored by taste, by smell, by observing bubble patterns on the surface. Different monasteries produced different strengths. Table beer. The weak stuff consumed daily was low alcohol, highly drinkable, meant for hydration and nutrition rather than intoxication. Stronger beers were reserved for feast days for guests for sale to generate revenue. Some monasteries produced 3-grade small beer for daily consumption, regular beer for special occasions, and strong beer for important guests and trading. The quantities involved were staggering. A large monastery might brew hundreds of gallons weekly. Each monk consumed perhaps a gallon. Daily sounds excessive until you remember it's replacing water, providing calories and preventing disease. Guests, workers, and the poor who appeared at the gate all received beer as part of hospitality. Brewing wasn't occasional, it was industrial-scale, constant production. Historians still argue about medieval drunkenness. With everyone drinking beer constantly, was everyone slightly buzzed all the time? Probably not. The alcohol content was low enough that your liver processed it steadily. You'd feel mild relaxation, maybe slight euphoria, but not impairment. It was more like drinking kombucha than craft IPA. The goal was safe hydration and nutrition, not intoxication. That said, stronger beers existed, and feast days saw consumption of higher alcohol varieties. Monks were human. Some brothers probably developed drinking problems. Account books occasionally mention discipline for excessive drinking. But the daily table beer wasn't the issue. It was the special occasion strong ales that created temptation. The taste was nothing like modern beer. No refrigeration, no filtration, no standardized yeast strains. Each batch was unique, influenced by ambient temperature, wild yeast varieties, grain quality, water mineral content. Some batches were excellent, some were barely drinkable. You drank what you got because the alternative was potentially deadly water. Seasonal variation affected brewing. Summer's heat could spoil beer quickly, or create overly vigorous fermentation. Winter's cold slowed fermentation, producing cleaner but slower batches. Spring and fall were ideal moderate temperatures, predictable fermentation. The best beer came from these seasons. Brewmasters learned to time their strongest brews for these optimal periods. The spent grain, the solid remains after mashing, became animal feed, soil amendment, or filler in bread during desperate times. The yeast sediment from fermentation could be reused for the next batch, though it gradually weakened. Nothing was wasted. Brewing was a closed loop where every byproduct had a purpose. Some monasteries became famous for their beer. Certain Belgian houses still brew today using medieval techniques, Chimay, Orval, Westmalle, Rochefort. These aren't museum pieces. They're living continuations of traditions perfected over centuries. Modern beer enthusiasts making pilgrimages to Trappist breweries are following paths worn by medieval travellers seeking the same thing, really good beer made by people who dedicated their lives to the craft. Water was available if you really wanted it. Well-cisterned, spring-fed systems. But water was for washing, for cooking, for extinguishing fires. Drinking it was mildly suspect. What kind of person chooses water when beer is available? Only the most austere orders, the ones who'd rejected beer as too pleasurable, relied on water, and they suffered for it with more frequent illness. The emotional role of beer shouldn't be underestimated. In a life of deprivation where meals were simple and pleasures few, that daily ration of ale represented comfort. It wasn't just safe liquid, it was familiar warming, slightly mood-elevating. After a day of hard labour in cold rain, returning to the refectory and receiving your mug of fresh ale was a small mercy that made continued existence bearable. You're sitting at dinner, bread and pottage before you, and beside your bowl sits a wooden mug of dark, cloudy ale. You lift it, smell the malty sweetness with herbal undertones, and drink. It's slightly warm, no refrigeration thick enough to coat your mouth faintly, sweet and bitter simultaneously. Your throat relaxes. Your shoulders drop slightly. The calories hit your bloodstream faster than solid food. This isn't indulgence. This is medicine, nutrition, safety, and small comfort combined in a single cup. You'll drink another at supper. Tomorrow you'll drink more. Every day for years, decades, however long you live in this place. The brewhouse never stops. Neither does your thirst. Between the two equilibrium emerges the monastery, breathing in grain and breathing out beer, sustaining itself one batch at a time. The refectory is where all the theological rules and nutritional strategies meet your actual body, and the experience is designed to make eating feel like worship rather than pleasure. You enter in silence, filing in with your brothers according to rank and seniority. The abbot sits at the head table on a raised platform. Everyone else arranges themselves at long wooden tables running perpendicular, creating a T-shape that emphasizes hierarchy even in communal eating. There's no casual chatting, no laughter, no clanking of utensils beyond what's absolutely necessary. Before anyone touches food, prayers are sung. The reader takes his position at an elevated pulpit. Yes, there's a pulpit in the dining hall, and begins whatever text has been assigned for mealtime. Usually scripture, sometimes lives of saints, occasionally monastic rules or theological treatises. His voice echoes off stone walls, filling the space with words while you eat in absolute silence. The silence serves multiple purposes. Practically, it prevents disputes, gossip, and the social dynamics that arise when men eat together. Spiritually, it keeps your focus on the sacred rather than the sensory. You're supposed to be feeding your soul through the reading, while coincidentally fueling your body through the meal. The food is necessary, but shouldn't be enjoyed for its own sake. That would be gluttony, attachment to physical pleasure, the kind of thing Benedict warned against. But here's where it gets interesting. The silence also amplifies every other sensation. You can't talk, so you notice everything else. The scrape of wooden spoon against wooden bowl, the sound of bread being torn, dozens of men tearing bread simultaneously creates a strange rustling chorus. The breathing of the brother beside you, the scuff of a sandal on stone floor, the reader's voice rising and falling with the cadence of whatever Latin text he's reciting, and the smells. In silence, your nose becomes more acute. You smell the pottage before it arrives. Cabbage, onions, herbs, that earthy bean smell that's become familiar. You smell the bread's yeasty warmth, the ale's malty sweetness, wood smoke from the kitchen, the smell of wool robes worn by men who bathed infrequently, the cold stone smell of the room itself. All of this registers more intensely because you can't distract yourself with conversation. The serving happens with choreographed precision. Kitchen brothers bring out large vessels of pottage, moving from table to table, ladling portions. Bread has already been distributed, your daily pound sitting at your place when you entered. Ale appears in jugs passed down the table for each man to fill his cup. Everything moves smoothly because this ritual happens twice. Daily has happened for years, will happen for years more. Everyone knows their role. You eat slowly. Partly this is practical, the pottage is hot, the bread is dense and requires chewing. Partly it's survival eating, slowly makes the meal last longer, creates the illusion of abundance, but mostly it's discipline. Eating too quickly suggests greed, suggests you're focused on the food, rather than the spiritual nourishment of the reading. You pace yourself, matching your eating speed to the brothers around you, everyone moving in approximate synchrony. The reader's voice provides rhythm. You take a bite when he finishes a sentence, another bite during the next phrase, sip your ale during a pause. The meal becomes a kind of liturgy, structured and timed, as formal as any other service. You're performing eating rather than simply eating, conscious of being observed by the abbot, by God, by yourself. Posture matters. You sit upright, feet flat, elbows off the table. Slouching suggests sloth. Leaning forward suggests excessive interest in the food. You maintain neutral, attentive posture, as though the meal were another form of prayer, which theologically it is gratitude for God's provision, discipline of the body, communal participation in necessary physical maintenance. The portions are what they are. No one gets seconds. No one complains about insufficient food or requests different dishes. You eat what's served in the amount provided. If you're still hungry afterward, and you usually are, the hunger is part of the program. Not starvation, just sustained undersatisfaction that keeps your body humble and your mind focused on higher things rather than dinner plans. Exceptions exist, of course. The abbot might receive subtly better food, whiter bread, perhaps meat on feast days while the brothers eat fish. Guests at the head table definitely eat better. Hospitality demands it. The sick in the infirmary have their own meal protocols. But in the main refectory, uniformity prevails. You eat what your brother eats. You receive what he receives. Hand signals allow necessary communication. A simple gesture requests the ale jug to be passed. Another indicates you're finished, and your bowl can be cleared. These signals are standardized. Everyone learns them during their novitiate, and using them feels like participating in a secret language that makes the silence less oppressive. The reader, interestingly, doesn't eat during his assigned shift. He reads straight through the meal, then eats afterward in the kitchen alone or with the next day's reader. This rotation means everyone eventually serves. Everyone takes their turn, feeding the community spiritually, while others feed physically. The role is considered important. The reader represents Christ speaking divine truth, while brothers consume earthly bread. Historians still argue about whether anyone actually listened to the readings, or just tuned them out as background noise. Probably both, depending on the reader's skill and the text's interest level. A dramatic saint's life held attention. A dry theological treatise might become pleasant droning that you half heard, while concentrating on your pottage. Either way, the rule was maintained. The meal happened in religious context, not secular indulgence. Clean-up was communal and swift. Everyone scraped their bowls clean. Wasting food was sinful. Wooden spoons and bowls were collected, rinsed, stacked. The refectory had to be ready for the next meal. Kitchen brothers handled the heavy work, but everyone participated in clearing the tables, folding away anything temporary, sweeping the floor if needed. Then you filed out, still silent, still ranked, into whatever came next. Work, prayer, rest, the perpetual cycle of monastic life. The meal was over, but its impact lingered. Your stomach was full or full enough. Your body had fuel for the next segment of the day. And somewhere in your mind, fragments of the reading might surface later, connecting the physical nourishment you'd received to the spiritual nourishment you'd heard. The refectory stands empty, now waiting. Tables bare. Silence complete rather than enforced. The smell of pottage fading. In a few hours it will fill again with the same men, the same ritual, the same sounds and smells and disciplined consumption. The room breathes with you between meals, waiting for the bell that will summon everyone back to this theatre of controlled eating, where hunger meets discipline and everyone plays their part in the endless performance of communal sustenance. Honey occupied a unique position in monastic life simultaneously: food, medicine, preservative, trade, good, and minor miracle. In a world without sugar cane or beet sugar, honey was the only concentrated sweetness available, and monasteries hoarded it like liquid gold, because in many ways it was more valuable than gold. Gold couldn't heal wounds, couldn't preserve fruit, couldn't sweeten the bitter herbal medicines that kept your community alive through winter. The relationship between monasteries and bees was symbiotic and ancient. Every substantial monastery maintained hives, sometimes dozens of them arranged in the garden or orchard, where bees could access flowers. The brother assigned to beekeeping, the apiarius, held specialized knowledge passed through generations. He understood bee behavior before anyone had microscopes to study it scientifically. He knew when to harvest, when to leave honey for the bee's own winter survival, how to split hives, how to calm swarms. Medieval beekeeping looked nothing like modern practice. No manufactured hives with removable frames, instead skeps made of woven straw, sometimes hollowed logs, occasionally wattle and daub structures. The bees built comb naturally inside these containers. Harvesting meant either destroying the hive entirely, killing the colony to extract all the honey and wax, or carefully cutting sections of comb and hoping the colony survived to rebuild. The two-product harvest was crucial. You got honey, obviously, but also beeswax, which was nearly as valuable. Wax became candles for the church. Beeswax candles were required for certain liturgical ceremonies considered purer than tallow. The church candle market alone justified maintaining hives. That the bees also produced honey was almost a bonus, though a bonus the monastery relied on absolutely. Honey's medicinal applications filled entire sections of monastic medical texts. Mixed with herbs, it became cough syrup, thyme honey for respiratory ailments, rosemary honey for headaches. Applied directly to wounds, it prevented infection through properties that modern science later identified as antibacterial, but which medieval monks just knew worked. Burns treated with honey healed faster, left less scarring. The infirmarian kept honey supplies separate from kitchen stores reserved for genuine medical need. As a preservative, honey enabled fruit storage that otherwise wouldn't exist. Late summer's abundance, berries, plums, pears, apples could be preserved in honey sealed in pottery jars and consumed months later when fresh fruit was a distant memory. Honey-preserved fruit provided vitamins through winter, prevented scurvy, added variety to the monotonous cold season diet. The preservation worked through honey's low water content, and acidity bacteria couldn't survive in it, allowing food to remain edible indefinitely. The taste of honey varied dramatically by season and location. Spring honey made from early wildflowers and fruit blossoms was light, delicate, almost floral. Summer honey from diverse garden flowers was amber, complex, rich. Late-season honey from ivy and autumn blooms was darker, more robust sometimes, almost medicinal. The apiarius recognized these variations, sometimes reserving specific harvests for specific purposes. Light honey for the sick, dark honey for cooking, medium honey for the abbot's table. Mead-fermented honey water existed in a canonical grey area. It was alcoholic, definitely often quite strong. Was it permissible? Some monasteries produced it enthusiastically, reasoning that honey wine was mentioned in scripture and therefore acceptable. Others banned it as too intoxicating, too pleasurable, too removed from simple sustenance. Those who made it often reserved it for guests and feast days rather than daily consumption. The economics of honey were fascinating. Monasteries traded it raw honey, Preserved fruits, made beeswax candles, even live bee colonies. A productive apiary generated significant revenue. Account books show honey listed alongside grain and wine as major trade goods. Some monasteries specialized in beekeeping, maintaining dozens or hundreds of hives, becoming regional honey suppliers. But the supply was never guaranteed. Harsh winters killed colonies. Disease swept through hives, bee plagues that mystified medieval apiarians who couldn't see the mites or infections responsible. Poor flowering years meant less nectar, less honey potential, starvation for bees, and scarcity for monks. The apiarius lived with constant anxiety about colony health, checking hives regularly, praying over sick swarms, sometimes losing years of careful cultivation to forces beyond his understanding or control. Swarming season late spring, when colonies split, naturally required careful management. A swarm leaving meant losing half your bees unless you caught them and established a new hive. The apiarius watched for swarm signs, crowded hives, queen cells, restless behavior. When a swarm emerged, thousands of bees in a cloud temporarily clustering on a tree branch, he had hours to collect them into a new skep before they flew away permanently. The collection process involved courage bordering on recklessness. You approached a writhing mass of thousands of stinging insects, positioned a skep beneath them, and shook the branch, hoping the queen fell into the container and the workers followed. Smoke helped. Burning herbs or dried dung produced smoke that calmed bees, made them docile. But docile was relative. Stings were inevitable. The apiarius developed tolerance, accepting stings as occupational hazards, occasionally suffering severe reactions that sent him to the infirmary. Honey consumption was rationed carefully. On ordinary days you might not see it at all. It was too valuable to waste on simple meals. Feast days brought honey-sweetened dishes, honey cakes, fruit in honey-honeyed wine. The sick received honey in their medicines, and sometimes spread on bread as easily digestible nutrition. The very old whose digestion weakened got honey more regularly. It was nourishing, required no chewing, and its natural sugars provided quick energy. The symbolic dimension wasn't lost on anyone. Honey appeared throughout Scripture, the promised land, flowing with milk and honey, Samson's lion filled with honey manna tasting of honey. Monastic writers drew elaborate parallels between bees' industrious communal life and monastic ideals. Bees work tirelessly without complaint, produce something sweet and useful, maintain strict organization, and serve their queen, obviously a metaphor for monks serving Christ and their abbot. Some mystical writers went further, seeing bees as divinely ordered creatures whose very existence proved God's design. How else could such tiny insects collaborate to build perfect hexagonal cells, navigate to distant flowers, and return to share their findings? Medieval natural philosophy couldn't explain bee communication or navigation, so it became evidence of divine programming creatures following celestial instructions. You're in the infirmary with a persistent cough. The infirmarian brings you a wooden cup containing honey, mixed with thyme, and hyssop dissolved in warm water. You sip it slowly. It's sweet, almost overwhelmingly. So after weeks of unsweetened pottage, but beneath the sweetness is herbal bitterness and the strange complex taste of honey itself. Your throat relaxes slightly. The cough subsides for a while. Outside in the garden, bees are working the lavender. You can't see them, but you know they're there, as they've been there every summer for as long as anyone remembers. Tiny creatures performing their mysterious labour, creating the golden substance that's coating your throat, easing your breathing, keeping you functional. The honey will run out eventually. Late winter, early spring, the jars will empty. But by then new flowers will be blooming, new bees will be foraging, and the cycle continues. Like everything else in the monastery, the honey never truly ends. It just pauses, waiting for the season to turn for the bees to begin again. The infirmary operates under different rules, not opposite to the refectory's discipline, but adjacent to it, occupying a space where necessity trumps austerity. When you're genuinely sick, when your body is failing rather than simply being disciplined, the usual dietary restrictions relax in ways that would be scandalous anywhere else in the monastery. This isn't hypocrisy, it's pragmatic theology. A dead monk serves no one. A recovered monk can return to prayer and labour. The infirmary exists to facilitate that recovery, and food becomes medicine administered with careful precision. The definition of sick enough was the infirmarian's burden. Too strict and brothers suffered needlessly or died from treatable conditions. Too lenient, and the infirmary became a restaurant for anyone who fancied egg for breakfast. Most infirmarians developed a diagnostic eye. They could tell genuine illness from malingering, could distinguish between needs rest and better food, and needs last rites. The judgment calls were constant and politically fraught because food privileges were serious business in a community where everyone else ate pottage. Legitimate illness earned you a private bed, rare luxury, and a special menu. Eggs appeared sometimes boiled, sometimes beaten into milk or ale for easier consumption. Cheese even during seasons when it was forbidden elsewhere. White bread made from sifted flour, easier on troubled digestion than the coarse dark loaves served in the refectory. Chicken broth clear and nourishing, made from birds whose meat you still couldn't eat, but whose cooking liquid somehow occupied an acceptable category. Milk sweetened with honey for the very sick, the very old, anyone whose digestion had collapsed beyond handling solid food. Meat entered the picture in extremis. If you were dying, the prohibition lifted entirely. Chicken, lamb, even beef might appear. The logic being that a dying man's soul mattered more than dietary rules, and if eating meat gave him strength to receive last rites properly, then meat was medicinal. Some brothers miraculously recovered after receiving meat, which created awkward situations. Were they faking terminal illness to get beef? Or did the meat actually provide nutrients their depleted bodies desperately needed? Probably both, depending on the individual case. The infirmarian kept separate stores: honey for wounds and coughs, fine flour for invalid bread, eggs from the henhouse allocated specifically for the sick. Wine of better quality than the table wine, sometimes imported, sometimes aged longer, reserved for those who needed fortification. These stores were inventoried carefully because theft was tempting. A healthy monk sneaking infirmary eggs violated multiple rules simultaneously and faced severe discipline if caught. Portion sizes expanded in the infirmary. The standard refectory serving assumed a healthy body doing normal labour, a feverish body, a body recovering from injury, a body wasted by chronic illness. These needed more calories, more nutrition, more frequent meals. The infirmarian might order 3 or 4 small meals daily rather than the usual 1 or 2. He might send extra bread, additional eggs, another cup of broth, whatever it took to rebuild strength. Certain conditions had specific dietary treatments based on humoral theory. Fevers being hot and dry required cold and moist foods, barley water, lettuce, cucumbers, if available, milk products. Phlegmatic conditions, colds, coughs. Mucus needed hot and dry treatments. Wine, pepper, if available, warming spices, foods that would dry the humour. Digestive troubles got bland, easily processed foods. Wounds and blood loss called for blood-building foods. Red wine liver, when available, iron-rich preparations. The elderly received semi-permanent infirmary status in many communities. Past a certain age, you couldn't maintain the regular routine. Your teeth failed, making coarse bread impossible to chew. Your digestion weakened, unable to process heavy pottage. Your body couldn't handle the one-meal winter schedule. So you moved to the infirmary full-time, receiving softer foods, more frequent meals, accommodations that acknowledged your body's decline, while keeping you alive and functional as long as possible. Psychological care accompanied the dietary changes. The infirmarian wasn't just a medical practitioner, he was counselor, confessor, and compassionate presence for men who were frightened in pain or facing death. The special food was part of that care, a tangible sign that your suffering was recognized, your needs were being met. In a culture that emphasized communal uniformity, the individualized attention of the infirmary was profound. Visitors to the sick received their own protocol. Your brothers might come read to you, pray with you, sit in companionable silence. They didn't share your food that would violate their own dietary rules, but they witnessed your eating the forbidden eggs or cheese without judgment, understanding that different circumstances require different standards. This created a strange dynamic. Everyone knew the infirmary rules were more generous. Everyone occasionally wished they qualified, but no one genuinely wanted to be sick enough to earn admittance. Recovery meant gradual reintegration. You didn't jump from infirmary eggs back to refectory pottage overnight. The infirmarian designed a transition. Maybe you started attending refectory meals, but received an extra portion, or supplemented refectory food with infirmary bread for a week. The goal was rebuilding strength without shocking your system or making you resentful of returning to normal restrictions. Some brothers never fully recovered, lingering in that twilight state, where they weren't dying but couldn't resume full monastic life. They became permanent infirmary residents, a separate class within the community. They attended what services they could, did light work if able, but lived under modified rules that acknowledged their limitations. The food privileges continued indefinitely, necessity rather than indulgence, keeping them alive even if not fully functional. The infirmary diet also revealed class tensions that the refectory's uniformity obscured. Everyone knew the abbot ate better than common monks. But seeing a sick brother eat eggs and cheese while you gnawed dark bread made the inequality visceral, even though the sick brother would gladly trade places. Food inequality justified by illness was acceptable. The same inequality without justification would be scandalous. The infirmary existed at that boundary, making visible the monastery's flexibility about rules when circumstances demanded. Historians still argue about infirmary abuse. Did healthy monks fake illness for better food? Probably sometimes. Were infirmarians complicit, granting infirmary status to favourites? Possibly occasionally, but the system generally worked because genuine illness was obvious. Faking it required sustained deception, and the community was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's baseline health. You couldn't fake a fever for weeks. You couldn't pretend to be dying convincingly if you weren't. You're lying in an infirmary bed recovering from a lung infection that's left you weak and hollow-chested. The infirmarian brings a wooden bowl containing something that smells rich and unfamiliar after weeks of pottage. You look down chicken broth, clear and golden, with bits of white bread softening in it. A boiled egg sits beside the bowl. A cup of wine, not the watered table wine, but something fuller, darker. You eat slowly, almost guiltily aware that your brothers in the refectory are eating their usual pottage. But the guilt fades as your body accepts the nutrition, as strength trickles back into your limbs. This isn't indulgence, this is repair. Your body is broken machinery receiving the materials needed for reconstruction. Tomorrow you'll eat similar fare, and the day after, until the infirmarian judges you strong enough to return to regular life, to regular food, to the regular hunger that defines normal monastic existence. For now, though, you drink the broth, you eat the egg, you sip the wine, and you feel your body begin slowly to remember what health feels like. Feast days puncture the year's austerity like stars in a dark sky, rare enough to remain special, frequent enough to provide psychological survival. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost. The patron saint's day, major apostle, celebrations perhaps 24 days annually, when the normal rules suspend, and the refectory transforms into something almost celebratory. Not indulgent, never gluttonous, but undeniably more generous than the endless pottage and bread baseline you've grown accustomed to. The preparation begins days in advance. You can sense it in the kitchen's activity level, in the cellarer's suddenly frequent trips to the stores, in the way the cooks consult with the abbot about the menu. Feast days require planning, because you're not just scaling up the usual meal, you're serving fundamentally different food that takes time, skill and resources the monastery doesn't normally deploy. Meat appears, and this is the revolution. Not for every order, Cistercians maintained their prohibition even on feast days, substituting extra fish instead, but for most Benedictine communities, feast days meant poultry at minimum. Chicken, goose, duck if you were near water. The birds were slaughtered, plucked, prepared with the ceremony that acknowledged their rarity. Some monasteries maintained their own poultry, others purchased birds from nearby farms, specifically for feast days the expense justified by the calendar's demands. The cooking techniques shifted entirely. Daily pottage required nothing but boiling. Feast day poultry demanded roasting, which meant the great kitchen hearth blazing at full intensity, birds on spits turning slowly fat dripping into pans below where it was caught for basting. The smell was intoxicating, roasting meat herbs, the crackling sound of skin crisping. Brothers passing near the kitchen caught these scents hours before the meal and felt their mouths water involuntarily. Side dishes multiplied. Not just 2 dishes as the rule specified, but 3, 4, sometimes more. Root vegetables roasted alongside the meat rather than boiled into pottage. Carrots, parsnips, turnips taking on caramelized edges. Dried fruits stewed with honey and spices creating sweet, savory combinations that seemed impossibly luxurious. Fresh bread, whiter and finer than usual, baked specifically for the feast. Butter appeared previously forbidden, or tightly rationed, now spread on that fine bread, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Wine flowed more generously. Not just the standard hemina, but double portions, sometimes even 3. Better wine too, the abbot authorized opening stores reserved for guests for occasions exactly like this. The wine tasted different, richer, less watered, and it affected you differently too. After months of mild table wine, a generous pour of stronger stuff went to your head, pleasantly creating a warmth that spread from your stomach outward. The refectory itself looked different, sometimes candles beyond the minimum, creating brighter light. Sometimes decoration branches or flowers depending on the season, simple, but acknowledging that this day was special. The tables might be arranged differently, the seating shuffled small changes that broke the monotonous routine and signaled today is not like other days. The silence rule relaxed, not abolished, but softened. Conversation wasn't exactly permitted, but laughter at the reader's more amusing passages went unremarked. A whispered comment to your neighbour didn't earn immediate censure. The atmosphere lightened, became almost convivial, still formal, but with an undercurrent of celebration that would be completely inappropriate on ordinary days. Portions expanded dramatically. Your plate, actual plate, not just a bread trencher, held more food than you'd normally see in an entire day. The poultry serving was substantial, not a symbolic taste. The vegetables came in generous heaps. The bread supply seemed unlimited, and you were tacitly encouraged to eat it all, to enjoy it, to fill yourself to genuine satiety. rather than the perpetual semi-hunger that was your baseline. The psychological impact was more significant than the nutritional. Yes, your body appreciated the protein, the fat, the extra calories, but your mind needed the feast even more. After months of disciplined restraint, of eating just enough, of treating food as necessary fuel rather than pleasure, the feast reminded you that pleasure wasn't entirely sinful, that God's creation included deliciousness, that celebrating major holy days with exceptional food was itself a form of worship. Different orders calibrated their feast differently. The Cluniacs developed a reputation for elaborate celebrations that shocked stricter communities, multiple meat courses, complex preparations, feasts stretching hours. The Carthusians barely acknowledged feast days at all, perhaps adding fish where they'd normally have only vegetables. Most Benedictine houses landed somewhere in the middle, noticeably better than daily fare, but not luxurious enough to constitute scandal. The feast's aftermath was its own experience. You left the refectory actually full, stomach distended, slightly uncomfortable, unused to the sensation. Your body had to process more food than it typically received, which made you sleepy, slightly sluggish. The afternoon's work proceeded more slowly. Vespers found brothers fighting drowsiness. No one mentioned it, but everyone felt it, the pleasant heaviness of genuine satiety. Historians still argue about the feast day's theological justification. Critics then and now said they contradicted monastic poverty and simplicity. Defenders argued they honoured God's generosity, celebrated the liturgical calendar appropriately, and provided necessary nutrition that kept the community healthy enough to maintain their austere schedule the rest of the year. Both sides had valid points, which is probably why the debate never resolved. The contrast was the point, though. Feast days worked psychologically because they were rare. If you ate roasted chicken weekly, it would stop feeling special. The deprivation made the celebration meaningful. You appreciated the feast precisely because you knew tomorrow would return to pottage. The cycle of fasting and feasting created rhythm structure, something to anticipate during the hardest stretches of Lent or Advent. Some monasteries included the poor in feast day celebrations. The gates opened and local beggars received portions of the feast bread ale, sometimes meat. This public generosity served multiple purposes: Christian charity community relations and demonstrating that the monastery's relative wealth wasn't purely selfish. You celebrated, but you shared the celebration, which made the indulgence feel more justifiable. The return to normal food the next day was jarring. After roasted goose and honeyed fruits, plain pottage tasted particularly bland. Your stomach expected the previous day's abundance and protested the return to restraint. Some brothers reported feeling almost depressed the day after a feast, the contrast highlighting just how austere normal life was. But this too was part of the design. The feast's memory sustained you through the next stretch of ordinary days, a bright spot you could recall when hunger and monotony pressed hardest. You're sitting at Easter dinner, the greatest feast of the year. Before you, roasted chicken with crispy skin and tender meat, root vegetables glazed with honey, white bread with butter, dried fruit stewed with spices you can't identify, but that smell like distant lands, wine generous and red and complex. Around you, brothers are actually smiling, actually engaged with their food, in ways that would be unthinkable tomorrow. You eat slowly, savouring each bite, aware that this is your annual allotment of such plenty. The chicken tastes almost unbearably good after months of fish and vegetables. The honey sweetness of the fruit makes your teeth ache pleasantly. The wine softens the edges of everything, creating a glow that's part intoxication, part gratitude, part relief. Tomorrow pottage returns. Tomorrow the silence weighs heavier. Tomorrow hunger reasserts itself as your constant companion. But today you feast. Today you celebrate the resurrection with the best your community can provide. Today you eat until you're full, and you're grateful, and you remember why enduring the ordinary days might actually be worthwhile. The bells will ring soon for Vespers. But for now, this moment, there's chicken and wine and the sound of your brothers breathing deeply contentedly together. The monastery's food culture wasn't universal. It fractured dramatically along geographical lines, creating regional variations so distinct that a monk transferred from Spain to Norway would barely recognize the meals as following the same rule. Climate, local agriculture, trade routes, and cultural inheritance shaped what appeared in each refectory, proving that Benedict's vague guidelines could stretch to accommodate radically different environments without breaking. Mediterranean monasteries, Italy, southern France, coastal Spain, operated in an entirely different nutritional universe than their northern counterparts. Olive oil flowed freely, providing fat and calories that northern houses struggled to obtain. Vegetables grew year-round in milder climates. Winter didn't mean months of stored roots, but rather a shift in what was fresh. Grapes for wine were local, abundant, cheap. Fish from the Mediterranean offered variety: anchovies, sardines, mackerel that cold northern seas couldn't match in diversity if not quantity. The olive oil question created theological tensions. Was it a luxury? It was certainly fatty, calorie-dense, flavourful. But it came from plants, not animals. Mediterranean monks used it liberally in cooking on bread for preserving vegetables. Northern monks lacking access to olive oil viewed this as suspiciously indulgent. Southern monks countered that northern reliance on butter when they could get it was far more problematic since it came from animals. Both sides considered themselves properly austere while the other compromised. Wine versus ale split along similar lines. Mediterranean climates grew grapes easily. Wine was the default, cheap, abundant, sometimes higher quality than water. Northern regions struggled with viticulture, shorter growing seasons, colder temperatures, less reliable harvests. Beer became their wine equivalent, but the two beverages weren't interchangeable. Wine had scriptural authority. Beer was folk tradition, elevated to necessity. Southern monks pitied northern houses that had to drink beer. Northern monks suspected southern wine consumption exceeded the rule's moderation. Scandinavian and northern European monasteries faced brutal constraints. Growing seasons were short, 4 or 5 months instead of 8 or 9. Root vegetables and hardy grains dominated because they'd actually mature before frost. Preservation became more critical. You needed to store enough food for 6-month winters rather than 3-month cold snaps. Fish was abundant: cod, herring, salmon, depending on location, but monotonous. The lack of vegetable variety during winter created nutritional challenges that southern houses never confronted. Some Norwegian monasteries maintained what amounted to warehouses of dried cod and stockfish. Fish, split, salted, air-dried until it became nearly imperishable, but also nearly inedible without extensive soaking and pounding. This preserved protein through winters, when nothing grew, nothing could be caught fresh, and stored grains might run low. The taste was reportedly awful, texture worse, but it prevented starvation, which was the goal. Spanish monasteries incorporated Moorish agricultural techniques and crops. Saffron, almonds, citrus fruits, rice, all available in Iberian regions through Islamic cultural influence. Some houses produced sophisticated dishes that northern Europeans would consider impossibly exotic: rice, with saffron almond milk as dairy substitute, preserved lemons. Were these compatible with monastic simplicity? Spanish monks thought so. Monks elsewhere weren't sure. English monasteries had access to exceptional fisheries and developed sophisticated fish-eating cultures. Not just basic cod and herring, but eel pies, lamprey stews, salmon preparations, oysters from coastal beds. The variety partially compensated for the limited growing season and frequent grey weather. But English houses also faced frequent crop failures. Wet summers, rotted grain, harsh winters killed stored vegetables. Feast and famine cycles were more extreme than in stable Mediterranean climates. German and Central European monasteries pioneered beer brewing techniques that became legendary. The beer wasn't just hydration, but major caloric source brewed stronger and more skillfully than elsewhere. Hop cultivation became sophisticated German houses, developing varieties and methods that influenced later commercial brewing. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, beets were prepared with Germanic thoroughness, sliced and layered and slow-cooked, in ways that extracted maximum nutrition. Altitude mattered as much as latitude. Alpine monasteries at high elevations faced challenges lowland houses never imagined. Shorter growing seasons even at Mediterranean latitudes, harder frosts, limited crops that could survive mountain conditions, but also access to alpine pastures, which meant dairy cheese, especially, became central to diets in ways that valley monasteries might consider excessive. Trade networks allowed some equalization. A wealthy monastery could import olive oil, wine, spices, dried fruits from regions that produced them, but this cost money and raised questions about poverty vows. Was importing Spanish saffron compatible with Benedictine simplicity? Some abbots said yes, arguing that maintaining community health justified the expense. Others said no, insisting on eating only what local land provided. Fasting practices varied regionally too. Mediterranean Lent was less physically devastating than Northern European Lent, because fresh vegetables appeared earlier, fish was more varied, the baseline diet was richer to begin with. A Spanish monk fasting on vegetables and olive oil was better nourished than an English monk fasting on turnips and dried cod. This created perceptions that southern houses were lax, which southerners resented. Some monasteries developed export specialties. French houses produced cheeses. Italian houses made specific wines. English houses traded wool, which wasn't food but generated income to purchase food. German houses sold beer. These economic activities supported the communities, but also tied them to commercial networks that felt increasingly removed from Benedict's vision of self-sufficient rural poverty. The question of authenticity was constant. Which regional variant most faithfully followed? The rural Mediterranean monks argued they ate closer to what Benedict originally envisioned. He was Italian, wrote in a Mediterranean context, probably assumed olive oil and wine. Northern monks countered that they practiced greater actual austerity because their environment was harsher, their food scarcer, their survival more precarious. Neither side convinced the other. Visiting monks from different regions reported culture shock. A Norwegian monk visiting Spain found the food suspiciously flavorful, the portions generous, the whole enterprise slightly scandalous. A Spanish monk visiting Norway found the food inedible, the climate hellish, and couldn't understand how anyone maintained religious contemplation while slowly freezing and subsisting on fish leather. Both returned home convinced their own monastery struck the proper balance. Climate change, the medieval warm period followed by the Little Ice Age, shifted regional capacities. During warmer centuries, English vineyards produced decent wine. When temperatures dropped, those vineyards failed, forcing greater reliance on imported wine or switching to beer. Alpine passes stayed open longer during warm periods, facilitating trade. During cold periods, mountain monasteries became isolated for months, increasing their self-sufficiency demands. You're reading a letter from a brother house in Sicily. They're describing their daily meals, olive oil on bread, fresh vegetables, even in winter fish from the Mediterranean wine. That sounds remarkably good. You're sitting in northern England, where it's been raining for 3 weeks, where yesterday's pottage was turnips and dried peas, where the ale is thin and the bread is getting mouldy in storage. Are they following the same rule you're following? Technically, yes. The words are identical, but the lived experience is completely different. They're practicing Mediterranean austerity. You're practicing Northern European survival. Both communities consider themselves properly observant. Both are probably right. The diversity isn't corruption, it's adaptation. Benedict wrote principles, not recipes. The principles bend to accommodate Norwegian winters and Spanish summers, German forests and Italian gardens, North Sea fisheries and alpine pastures. The bending is how the system survives. Outside rain continues. Inside the pottage pot simmers with what grows here, what stores here, what keeps you alive here. Tomorrow's meal will look nothing like the Sicilian monasteries, but tomorrow's prayers will be identical, chanted in the same Latin following the same hours. The food differs, the worship doesn't. Maybe that's the point Benedict intended all along. The monastery's food culture wasn't universal. It fractured dramatically along geographical lines, creating regional variations so distinct that a monk transferred from Spain to Norway would barely recognize the meals as following the same rule. Climate, local agriculture, trade routes, and cultural inheritance shaped what appeared in each refectory, proving that Benedict's vague guidelines could stretch to accommodate radically different environments without breaking. Mediterranean monasteries, Italy, southern France, coastal Spain, operated in an entirely different nutritional universe than their northern counterparts. Olive oil flowed freely, providing fat and calories that northern houses struggled to obtain. Vegetables grew year-round in milder climates. Winter didn't mean months of stored roots, but rather a shift in what was fresh. Grapes for wine were local, abundant, cheap. Fish from the Mediterranean offered variety: anchovies, sardines, mackerel that cold northern seas couldn't match in diversity if not quantity. The olive oil question created theological tensions. Was it a luxury? It was certainly fatty, calorie-dense, flavourful. But it came from plants, not animals. Mediterranean monks used it liberally in cooking on bread for preserving vegetables. Northern monks lacking access to olive oil viewed this as suspiciously indulgent. Southern monks countered that northern reliance on butter when they could get it was far more problematic since it came from animals. Both sides considered themselves properly austere, while the other compromised. Wine versus ale split along similar lines. Mediterranean climates grew grapes easily. Wine was the default, cheap, abundant, sometimes higher quality than water. Northern regions struggled with viticulture, shorter, growing seasons, colder temperatures, less reliable harvests. Beer became their wine equivalent, but the two beverages weren't interchangeable. Wine had scriptural authority. Beer was folk tradition elevated to necessity. Southern monks pitied northern houses that had to drink beer. Northern monks suspected southern wine consumption exceeded the rule's moderation. Scandinavian and northern European monasteries faced brutal constraints. Growing seasons were short 4 or 5 months instead of 8 or 9. Root vegetables and hardy grains dominated because they'd actually mature before frost. Preservation became more critical. You needed to store enough food for 6-month winters rather than 3-month cold snaps. Fish was abundant: cod, herring, salmon, depending on location, but monotonous. The lack of vegetable variety during winter created nutritional challenges that southern houses never confronted. Some Norwegian monasteries maintained what amounted to warehouses of dried cod and stockfish. fish split, salted, air-dried, until it became nearly imperishable but also nearly inedible without extensive soaking and pounding. This preserved protein through winters when nothing grew, nothing could be caught fresh, and stored grains might run low. The taste was reportedly awful, texture worse. But it prevented starvation, which was the goal. Spanish monasteries incorporated Moorish agricultural techniques and crops. Saffron almonds, citrus fruits, rice, all available in Iberian regions through Islamic cultural influence. Some houses produce sophisticated dishes that northern Europeans would consider impossibly exotic rice, with saffron almond milk as dairy substitute preserved lemons. Were these compatible with monastic simplicity? Spanish monks thought so. Monks elsewhere weren't sure. English monasteries had access to exceptional fisheries and developed sophisticated fish-eating cultures. Not just basic cod and herring, but eel pies, lamprey stews, salmon preparations, oysters from coastal beds. The variety partially compensated for the limited growing season and frequent grey weather. But English houses also faced frequent crop failures, wet summers, rotted grain, harsh winters, killed stored vegetables. Feast and famine cycles were more extreme than in stable Mediterranean climates. German and Central European monasteries pioneered beer brewing techniques that became legendary. The beer wasn't just hydration, but major caloric source brewed stronger and more skillfully than elsewhere. Hop cultivation became sophisticated German houses developing varieties and methods that influenced later commercial brewing. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, beets were prepared with Germanic thoroughness, sliced and layered and slow cooked in ways that extracted maximum nutrition. Altitude mattered as much as latitude. Alpine monasteries at high elevations faced challenges lowland houses never imagined. Shorter growing seasons even at Mediterranean latitudes, harder frosts, limited crops that could survive mountain conditions, but also access to alpine pastures, which meant dairy cheese especially became central to diets in ways that valley monasteries might consider excessive. Trade networks allowed some equalization. A wealthy monastery could import olive oil, wine, spices, dried fruits from regions that produced them. But this cost money and raised questions about poverty vows. Was importing Spanish saffron compatible with Benedictine simplicity? Some abbots said yes, arguing that maintaining community health justified the expense. Others said no, insisting on eating only what local land provided. Fasting practices varied regionally too. Mediterranean Lent was less physically devastating than Northern European Lent because fresh vegetables appeared. Earlier fish was more varied, the baseline diet was richer to begin with. A Spanish monk fasting on vegetables and olive oil was better nourished than an English monk fasting on turnips and dried cod. This created perceptions that southern houses were lax, which southerners resented. Some monasteries developed export specialties. French houses produced cheeses. Italian houses made specific wines. English houses traded wool, which wasn't food, but generated income to purchase food. German houses sold beer. These economic activities supported the communities, but also tied them to commercial networks that felt increasingly removed from Benedict's vision of self-sufficient rural poverty. The question of authenticity was constant. Which regional variant most faithfully followed the rule? Mediterranean monks argued they ate closer to what Benedict originally envisioned. He was Italian, wrote in a Mediterranean context, probably assumed olive oil and wine. Northern monks countered that they practiced greater actual austerity because their environment was harsher, their food scarcer, their survival more precarious. Neither side convinced the other. Visiting monks from different regions reported culture shock. A Norwegian monk visiting Spain found the food suspiciously flavourful, the portions generous, the whole enterprise slightly scandalous. A Spanish monk visiting Norway found the food inedible, the climate hellish, and couldn't understand how anyone maintained religious contemplation while slowly freezing and subsisting on fish leather. Both returned home convinced their own monastery struck the proper balance. Climate change, the medieval warm period followed by the Little Ice Age shifted regional capacities. During warmer centuries, English vineyards produced decent wine. When temperatures dropped, those vineyards failed, forcing greater reliance on imported wine or switching to beer. Alpine passes stayed open longer during warm periods, facilitating trade. During cold periods, mountain monasteries became isolated for months, increasing their self-sufficiency demands. You're reading a letter from a brother house in Sicily. They're describing their daily meals, olive oil on bread, fresh vegetables, even in winter, fish from the Mediterranean wine. That sounds remarkably good. You're sitting in northern England where it's been raining for 3 weeks, where yesterday's pottage was turnips and dried peas, where the ale is thin and the bread is getting mouldy in storage. Are they following the same rule you're following? Technically, yes. The words are identical, but the lived experience is completely different. They're practicing Mediterranean austerity. You're practicing Northern European survival. Both communities consider themselves properly observant. Both are probably right. The diversity isn't corruption, it's adaptation. Benedict wrote principles, not recipes. The principles bend to accommodate Norwegian winters and Spanish summers, German forests and Italian gardens, North Sea fisheries and alpine pastures. The bending is how the system survives. Outside, rain continues. Inside, the pottage pot simmers with what grows here, what stores here, what keeps you alive here. Tomorrow's meal will look nothing like the Sicilian monasteries, but tomorrow's prayers will be identical, chanted in the same Latin, following the same hours. The food differs. The worship doesn't. Maybe that's the point Benedict intended all along. The guest hall presents a fascinating contradiction at the heart of monastic life. A space where the rules you live by daily don't apply, where meat appears on tables while you stand nearby serving it forbidden from eating what you're literally placing in front of strangers. Benedict's rule commanded radical hospitality receive every guest as Christ himself, but Christ apparently eats better than his monks do, and you're the one cooking for him. Hospitality was non-negotiable. Travellers, pilgrims, nobles, merchants, church officials, anyone arriving at the monastery gate received food and shelter. The quality varied by guest status, but the principle held no one was turned away hungry. This created a parallel food system running alongside the monastic diet, overlapping but distinct, governed by different rules that highlighted just how specific your dietary restrictions actually were. Meat appeared in the guest hall regularly, not just on feast days, but whenever important guests arrived. Roasted poultry, sometimes beef or pork, served with appropriate accompaniments. The logic was straightforward. Guests weren't bound by monastic rules, and offering them the same pottage you ate would insult them. Hospitality required providing food appropriate to their status and expectations. If that meant meat, then meat it was. You prepared and served this meat. As kitchen brother or server you handled it, cooked it, carried it to tables, watched guests eat it. The smell filled the guest hall, roasted meat-fat herbs, while you maintained perfect composure, showing no desire, no resentment. This was your test serving luxury you couldn't partake in, demonstrating that your abstinence was genuine discipline, not merely lack of access. The temptation was obvious and acknowledged. Monastic rules specifically address this scenario, warning against stealing food meant for guests sneaking tastes during preparation or envying those who could eat freely. Some brothers failed the test. Account books occasionally record discipline for monks caught eating guest food. The fact that rules existed against it proves it happened with some regularity. Wealthier guests received elaborate meals that would scandalize the refectory. Multiple courses, fine wine, white bread, butter, cheese without restriction, desserts sweetened with honey or imported sugar if the monastery was truly prosperous. The abbot often dined with important guests, which meant he ate their food rather than monastic fare. This created visible inequality, your abbot consuming roasted venison while you chewed dark bread justified by hospitality obligations, but uncomfortable nonetheless. The guest hall wine was noticeably better. Monasteries kept separate stores, table wine for monks, good wine for guests, exceptional wine for bishops and nobility. You might serve wine to a visiting lord that you'd never taste yourself, wine aged for years, wine imported from prestigious vineyards. The guest would praise the monastery's cellar, oblivious that the brothers who maintained it drank entirely different stuff. Some monasteries developed reputations as excellent hosts, which created its own problems. If your guest hall was too comfortable, too generous, you'd attract more visitors, which drained resources and disrupted the community's contemplative rhythm. But turning away, guests violated the rule. Some houses implemented subtle discouragement, comfortable enough to fulfill obligations, not so comfortable that people lingered unnecessarily. The servers who worked the guest hall occupied an ambiguous position. They were monks, but operated in secular space, interacting with worldly people discussing worldly matters. They heard news from outside gossip political developments. They saw wealth fashion the broader culture they'd theoretically renounced. Some found this exciting a window to the world they'd left. Others found it disturbing, a reminder of temptations they'd thought conquered. Pilgrim hospitality differed from noble hospitality. Pilgrims received food, but simpler fare, bread ale, basic pottage, perhaps dried fish. Still better than they'd get at a tavern, but not the elaborate presentations nobles received. This tiered system made economic sense, but created visible class distinctions that sat uncomfortably with Christianity's egalitarian ideals. Christ said, "Whatever you do, to the least you do to him." But apparently the least got pottage while the greatest got roasted peacock. The monastery's reputation partly depended on guest satisfaction. A noble who dined well, slept comfortably, and left impressed might donate land money or political support. Poor hospitality could damage relationships with powerful patrons. So the guest hall became simultaneously spiritual obligation and political strategy, genuine service and calculated investment. Some guests were former monks or clergy who'd left orders visiting with a strange combination of nostalgia and relief. They ate the meat you served, drank the wine you poured, slept in the comfortable guest beds, and you could see them thinking, "I used to live like you do now under those restrictions, eating that food. Now I don't." Was leaving the right choice? The question hung unspoken in the air while you refilled their wine cup. Historians still argue about enforcement. Were monks truly forbidden from eating guest food, or was this one of those rules that was officially strict but practically flexible? Evidence suggests variation by community and circumstance. Strict houses enforced absolute separation. Laxer houses might allow brothers to share in exceptional guest meals during major feasts. Most probably fell somewhere in the middle, officially forbidden, but occasionally overlooked when no one important was watching. The emotional toll was real. Day after day you served food you couldn't eat to people who hadn't earned it through any spiritual discipline. They appeared and left while you remained hungry, disciplined, committed. Sometimes this felt noble, you were serving Christ in the stranger. Sometimes it felt like cosmic injustice. Why should random travellers eat better than dedicated religious who'd given up everything? The guest hall also revealed how unusual your diet actually was. Outsiders found monastic food strange, insufficient, unappetizing. Guests occasionally expressed pity. How do you survive on so little? You'd explain about discipline, spiritual focus following the rule, and they'd nod politely while clearly thinking you were half starving by choice, which in a sense you were. Some monks sought guest hall assignments precisely because it meant contact with the wider world. Others avoided it for the same reason. The abbot assigned brothers to guest service carefully, considering who could handle the exposure without their vocation wavering. Young monks rarely served guests. Old monks who'd proven their stability did. The assignment was trust and test simultaneously. The guest hall's existence made the monastery's food culture more complex. You weren't just practicing personal discipline, you were maintaining parallel systems, one for yourselves and one for others. This required sophisticated management, separate kitchens, or carefully timed cooking, separate stores, separate accounting. The cellar tracked guest provisions separately from community provisions, because confusion would be financial disaster. You're standing in the guest hall holding a platter of roasted duck. The visiting bishop is dining with your abbot, and you're serving them. The duck smells incredible. Herbs, roasted skin fat glistening. You place it before the bishop, who nods absently, continuing his conversation. Neither he nor the abbot acknowledges your presence. You return to the kitchen where your own dinner waits, bread and pottage, same as always. The smell of duck follows you, memory of what you can't have. You eat your pottage slowly, deliberately, reminding yourself why the difference matters, why your restriction has meaning. Tomorrow other guests will arrive. You'll cook for them, serve them, watch them eat what you prepared but cannot consume. This is your service. This is your discipline. This is your life. The duck was delicious, you're certain. The pottage is adequate. The gap between them is where your vocation lives, in that space between serving and being served, between hunger and satisfaction, between the food you make and the food you're given. The monastery's relationship with the land beyond its walls was complicated, often contradictory, and absolutely central to how you ate. Most monasteries owned extensive property, forests, farms, fish ponds, mills, sometimes entire villages worked by lay people who weren't monks, but whose labour fed the community. This created moral and practical puzzles. If you've renounced worldly wealth, what does it mean to own a forest full of deer? If you can't eat meat, who's harvesting the animals living on your land? The forests were particularly fraught. Many monasteries received woodland grants from nobles seeking spiritual credit. These forests contained deer, wild boar, rabbits, game birds, valuable protein sources that the monks themselves couldn't consume under most interpretations of the rule. But the forests also provided timber for building and fuel, grazing for pigs, forage for cattle, space for beekeeping. You couldn't just ignore this resource because part of it was problematic. The solution was delegation. Lay brothers, servants, or tenant farmers did the hunting. They harvested deer, and boar processed the meat and sold it or distributed it to the monastery's dependents. The monks administered the forest-regulated hunting to prevent depletion and collected revenue, but they didn't personally hunt or consume the meat. This maintained the technical distinction. The monastery benefited from meat economically, without monks eating it spiritually, except when important guests arrived. Then venison from the monastery's own forest appeared in the guest hall, prepared by the monastery's cooks, served by the monastery's servers. You were intimately involved with meat production, you just weren't eating it yourself. The hair splitting was obvious to everyone, but theologically necessary. You could own the deer, manage the forest profit from the meat, just not taste it. Fish ponds were less controversial but more labour-intensive. Many monasteries constructed elaborate pond systems, multiple connected pools where fish were bred, raised, harvested. Carp were most common, but also pike, tench, bream, whatever species suited local conditions. These ponds required constant maintenance, clearing vegetation, managing water levels, preventing poaching, feeding the fish, harvesting at appropriate times. The work was considerable. Draining a pond to harvest fish meant temporarily relocating the stock, catching everything, sorting by size, cleaning the pond, refilling it. This happened annually or seasonally depending on the system. The monks supervised. Lay workers did most physical labour. The resulting fish went partly to the refectory, you definitely ate this protein, and partly to market-generating income. Some monasteries developed fish pond technology to impressive levels. French and German houses created cascading systems where water flowed through multiple ponds, each supporting different fish species or age groups. English houses dug enormous ponds that became landscape features still visible today as heritage sites. The investment was substantial, justified by the reliable protein source in regions where ocean access was limited. Wild fishing rights were similarly complex. Rivers running through monastic land provided fish, but who had rights to catch them? The monastery claimed ownership based on land grants. Local villages claimed traditional rights based on generations of use. Disputes were constant, sometimes violent. Your dinner might depend on legal battles over whether peasants could fish your river or whether eels caught downstream belonged to the monastery upstream. Eels were especially contentious. They migrated through rivers following patterns no one fully understood. Monasteries built eel traps, elaborate wicker or wooden structures that funneled eels into collection points. These traps were valuable, productive, and frequently vandalized by locals who resented monastic monopolies on resources. You ate eels, regularly oblivious to the conflicts that brought them to your table. Game birds presented another grey area. Monasteries owned land where wild birds lived, doves, waterfowl, occasionally swans. Were these the monastery's property or wild creatures anyone could take? Legal frameworks varied, but generally if it flew over your land you claimed some ownership. Dove houses' dovecotes were common, providing both eggs and young birds. The birds were technically wild, but practically domesticated, living in structures you built and maintained. You couldn't eat adult doves in most communities. They were birds technically, but too meat-like. But eggs were acceptable, and young squabs occupied that ambiguous category between egg and bird. Some houses ate them, others didn't. The debates echoed the barnacle goose arguments. At what point does an egg become meat? When it hatches, when it feathers, when it can fly. Monasteries reached different conclusions, each convinced of their correctness. Foraging supplemented cultivated food significantly. Mushrooms, wild herbs, nuts, berries all appeared in monastic diets depending on season and location. This required knowledge which mushrooms were safe, where to find them, when to harvest. Usually older monks or lay workers held this knowledge passed informally through observation. Written records rarely captured it, because it was obvious to practitioners and irrelevant to administrators. Some monasteries granted foraging rights to local poor, allowing them to gather fallen woodnuts berries from monastic land. This was charity, but also practical. You couldn't harvest everything yourselves, and letting locals take what you'd miss anyway built goodwill. But the boundaries were constantly negotiated. How much could they take? Which areas were off limits? What if they started hunting rather than just gathering? The mill situation was particularly interesting. Most monasteries owned watermills that ground grain for the surrounding area. Locals were often required to use the monastic mill, paying fees in grain or money. The mill generated significant income, but it also processed the grain you ate, so you owned the means of production for your own food while simultaneously profiting from others' need for that same production. The economics were feudal unavoidably even as you tried to practice poverty. Hunting for pest control created exceptions to meat prohibitions. Rabbits multiplying in the garden weren't game, they were agricultural threats. Killing them was maintenance, not hunting. But once dead, they were rabbit carcasses, edible protein. Some monasteries served them in the guest hall or sold them. Others found ways to classify them as acceptable monk food. They weren't really quadrupeds, more like large rats. And didn't rats not count? The reasoning was creative. Historians still argue about how much monks knew versus how much they deliberately didn't know. When venison appeared at the abbot's table, did he know which deer it came from, who shot it, how it was processed? Or did he maintain strategic ignorance it appeared from the stores, sources unspecified processed by others, his consumption justified by hospitality requirements? Probably both, depending on individual consciences. You're walking the monastery's forest with the lay brother who manages it. He points out deer tracks, explains the population is healthy, mentions they'll need to cull some before winter. You nod, understanding the necessity, aware that the meat from this culling will feed the monastery's dependents and guests. You'll never taste it, but your approval makes it possible. Is this ownership, renunciation, practical stewardship? All three somehow existing in uneasy balance. The forest is yours, but not yours. The animals are yours, but forbidden. The labour is delegated, but ultimately your responsibility. You return to the monastery for none for the meal that awaits bread, pottage fish from the ponds you own. The deer remain in the forest you own, eating vegetation on land you own, living and dying in a system you administer, but don't directly participate in. The boundaries are clear in theory, blurred in practice. You navigate them daily, trying to honour both the rule's spirit and the body's needs, managing resources without becoming worldly, owning land without forgetting poverty. The forest doesn't judge. Neither do the deer. They just live and die and feed someone, just not you. Let's talk numbers, because the medieval monks certainly didn't, and that absence is itself revealing. No monastery kept detailed calorie counts or nutritional analyses. They operated on observation and tradition. If brothers stayed healthy enough to work and pray, the diet was adequate. If they weakened, got sick, or died in unusual numbers, adjustments were made. It was empirical nutrition science without the science, and modern attempts to reconstruct their actual intake produce fascinating, sometimes contradictory results. Start with the bread, your guaranteed daily pound, roughly 450 grams. Medieval bread was dense, whole grain, probably somewhere between 100 and 400 calories depending on the grain mixture and moisture content. That's your baseline, your absolute minimum, the floor beneath which you couldn't fall without genuine starvation beginning. Already you're looking at half to 2/3 of what a moderately active adult male needs daily. The pottage adds considerably more, though quantities varied. A large bowl, maybe a litre of vegetable and legume pottage, could provide 300-500 calories more if it contained oil, or if the legumes were particularly dense. 2 bowls daily during the 2 meal seasons pushes you toward another 600-1,000 calories. Now you're approaching 1,700-400 calories on ordinary days, which starts to look adequate for maintenance. But here's where it gets complicated: labour requirements. Copying manuscripts, relatively sedentary work, might burn 800-2,000 calories daily. Heavy agricultural labour, clearing land, hauling stones, harvesting could burn 3,000-500. The same diet that maintains a scriptorium worker leaves a field worker in chronic deficit. Monasteries theoretically adjusted portions for labour intensity, but evidence suggests this was inconsistent. Some brothers were probably perpetually underfed. Add the ale a gallon daily of weak beer at perhaps 2–3% alcohol. That substantial liquid intake may be 200–300 calories plus B vitamins and minerals from the grain, not negligible. The ale alone could make the difference between marginal adequacy and genuine insufficiency. This explains why monasteries that restricted ale either for theological reasons or because brewing failed saw worse health outcomes. Fish days added protein but not necessarily many calories. A serving of dried cod or herring might provide 150–200 calories plus significant protein, maybe 30–40 grams. That's valuable for maintaining muscle mass, but it doesn't fuel heavy work. Fresh fish offered similar protein with slightly more fat, thus more calories, but availability was inconsistent. Coastal or riverside monasteries ate better than inland houses in this respect. Cheese and eggs, when permitted, changed the equation dramatically. A chunk of hard cheese, maybe 100 grams, adds 400 calories and substantial protein and fat. 2 eggs add another 150–180 calories plus complete protein. Suddenly, on days when dairy was allowed, you're easily clearing 2,500–3,000 calories, entering genuinely adequate territory even for harder labour. The feast days created massive spikes, probably 3,500–4,500 calories, when meat, extra bread, generous wine, and multiple dishes appeared. Your body didn't need this much, but it stored the excess as fat, providing reserves for the lean times. Medieval bodies probably fluctuated in weight more than modern bodies, fattening slightly during feast seasons, thinning during fasts, the cycle repeating annually. Lent created genuine deficits. Dropping dairy, reducing meal frequency, restricting portions, you're probably looking at 200–600 calories daily for 40 days. That's borderline starvation for an active male. Weight loss was inevitable, probably 5–10 pounds over the fast. Energy levels dropped. Immune function weakened, which explains why post-Lenten illness was common. The body was running on reserves, and reserves eventually depleted. Protein intake was probably adequate most of the time. The combination of legumes and grain provided complete proteins. Fish added high-quality animal protein. Dairy, when available, supplemented further. But protein quality varied. Some days you got all essential amino acids. Other days you missed some. Over weeks and months, this probably averaged out to adequacy, but individual days might be suboptimal. Fat intake was often marginal. Without animal products, you relied on occasional olive oil in southern houses, nuts when available, the small amounts in whole grains and legumes. This was probably the most consistently deficient macronutrient. Fat deficiency causes problems, vitamin absorption issues, hormone disruption, chronic hunger, even when calories are adequate. Northern European monks, especially lacking olive oil and restricting butter, probably operated in chronic mild fat deficiency. Micronutrients present a mixed picture. Vitamin C from vegetables and occasional fruit probably prevented scurvy most years, but late winter could be dicey when stored vegetables depleted and nothing fresh grew yet. B vitamins from whole grains and ale were likely adequate. Vitamin A from vegetables and dairy when available. Vitamin D was problematic in northern latitudes. You weren't getting much from food, and winter sun exposure was minimal. Some level of deficiency was probable. Iron intake was interesting. Whole grains and legumes provided iron, but plant-based iron absorbs poorly without vitamin C or heme-iron from meat to enhance it. Anemia was probably more common in monastic populations than among meat-eating populations, especially in houses with strict dairy prohibitions. Monks might have felt chronically fatigued partly from iron deficiency rather than just caloric restriction. Calcium availability depended heavily on dairy access. Communities that ate cheese regularly had adequate calcium. Those that didn't probably had marginal intake relying on whatever calcium existed in vegetables and hard water. Bone health issues might have emerged in later life, though distinguishing this from normal aging would be impossible without modern diagnostic tools. The remarkable thing is that this diet marginal in several respects sustained functional communities for centuries. Monks lived into their 60s or 70s, with some regularity better than peasant populations, suggesting the diet was adequate even if not optimal. The combination of guaranteed daily food varied if simple ingredients and strategic use of feast days to compensate for fast days created a system that worked despite apparent deficiencies. Historians still argue about whether monks were healthier or just better recorded. Monasteries kept death records. Peasant villages largely didn't. Maybe monks just seemed healthier because we know more about them. Or maybe the guaranteed food, relatively clean water from wells and beer, and protection from extreme poverty genuinely improved longevity. Probably both factors contributed. The caloric mathematics also explains the fierce debates about dairy and feast days. These weren't abstract theological positions, they were arguments about whether communities could maintain functionality on strict interpretations versus more generous ones. A house that eliminated dairy and restricted feast days was gambling with its members' health. Some communities lost that gamble. You're sitting at dinner eating your portion bred pottage ale. You have no idea this constitutes approximately 1,900 calories that you need, perhaps 2,400 for the work you did today, that you're operating in mild deficit that will accumulate over weeks until the next feast day compensates. You just know you're somewhat hungry as always, but not starving. Your body is functional. Tomorrow you'll wake and work and pray again. The math you don't know supports the life you're living. The calories are adequate barely. The protein is sufficient mostly. The vitamins are present sometimes. It's not optimal. It's not meant to be. It's meant to keep you alive, functional and slightly uncomfortable, which it does year after year until you're old or dead or both. The body adapts. The system works. The numbers, had anyone calculated them, would show you living on the edge of adequacy, perpetually bordering insufficiency, but rarely crossing into genuine crisis. And somehow that's enough. Not all monasteries maintained discipline, and the food culture was where that breakdown became most visible. By the late medieval period, 13th through 15th centuries, some communities had drifted so far from Benedict's austere vision that reformers raged about monks living like nobles while claiming poverty. Other houses doubled down on strictness, creating internal tensions between those who wanted to honour the rule's letter and those who'd found comfortable accommodations with its spirit. The food became a battlefield where competing visions of monastic life clashed. The abbot's table was ground zero for these conflicts. In theory, the abbot ate with his brothers, sharing their food, maintaining equality. In practice, many abbots maintained private quarters with separate kitchens, where meals bore no resemblance to refectory fare. Meat daily, not just on feasts. Fine wine, imported delicacies, multiple courses. The justification was always the same: abbots entertained important guests constantly, and those guests required appropriate hospitality. The abbot couldn't serve nobles pottage, so he ate what they ate, which happened to be substantially better than monastery fare. Some abbots were essentially living as wealthy lords who happened to wear religious habits. They hunted ostensibly, managing monastery forests, actually enjoying sport. They hosted elaborate banquets where monastic dietary rules were invisible. They travelled with entourages, staying at other monasteries or noble estates, eating whatever was served without concern for the restrictions their own brothers followed. The hypocrisy was obvious, widely criticised, and incredibly difficult to reform because abbots held substantial power. Wealthy monasteries accumulated resources that made austerity nearly impossible to maintain. Large landholdings generated significant income. That income bought better food, better wine, more variety. The cellarers' stores expanded beyond necessity into abundance. Some houses maintained multiple qualities of every commodity: common wine for daily use, good wine for minor feasts, excellent wine for major occasions, exceptional wine for important visitors. This stratification undermined the simplicity the rule championed. Private chambers became increasingly common, not just for abbots, but for senior monks, infirmarians, guest masters, anyone with administrative responsibility. These chambers often included private meals justified by the demands of their offices. A guest master couldn't abandon visiting nobles to eat in the refectory, so he ate in the guest hall. But then he was eating that better food regularly, not occasionally. The exception became the norm, and the norm became a separate privileged food culture. Corruption wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was just slow drift. A community might decide that the rule's 2 dishes could be interpreted more generously. Then that generous portions became normal. Then someone suggested 3 dishes weren't really that different from 2. Then feast days became more frequent because surely this saint deserved celebration too. Each change seemed minor, but cumulatively they transformed austere communities into comfortable ones. Reform movements erupted periodically, trying to restore original strictness. The Cistercians emerged in the 11th century, specifically rejecting Benedictine laxity, emphasizing manual labor and dietary discipline. They succeeded initially. Cistercian houses were notably stricter about food, but within a few generations they too accumulated wealth, built elaborate churches, and developed their own versions of the problems they'd fled. Reform was temporary. Drift was constant. The observant movement of the 15th century tried again, pushing communities back toward literal rule interpretation. Observant houses restricted portions, eliminated private chambers, reduced feast day indulgence, restored the one-meal winter schedule. This created bitter divisions within orders, observant houses condemning conventional houses as corrupt conventional houses, dismissing observance as extremist. Sometimes single monasteries split between factions, the same rule interpreted radically differently under the same roof. Food became a weapon in these conflicts. Reformers pointed to elaborate meals as evidence of corruption. Defenders argued that times had changed, that maintaining health in current conditions required more generous diet than 6th century Italy. Both sides marshalled. Authorities cited precedents, accused the other of either laxity or extremism. The debates were ostensibly about theology and rule interpretation, but they were really about whether monastic life should be actively uncomfortable or merely disciplined. Some communities developed formal 2-tier systems. Common monks lived under strict dietary rules. Officers, prior, cellarer, guest master at better, justified by their responsibilities. This was openly acknowledged, written into customaries, defended as necessary. The alternative, pretending equality existed when it didn't, seemed more dishonest than formalizing the distinction. But it created obvious resentment. Why did administrative work justify meat while manual labor didn't? The Black Death changed everything temporarily. With plague decimating communities, monasteries couldn't afford strictness that weakened survivors. Dietary rules relaxed out of necessity. You needed healthy brothers to maintain the services, and health required better nutrition. After the crisis passed, many communities never fully restored previous austerity. They discovered that more generous eating was possible, and rolling it back proved impossible once people had experienced the alternative. Wealth inequality among monasteries became stark. Rich houses in fertile regions with substantial endowments ate dramatically better than poor houses on marginal land with small budgets. A monk in a wealthy French abbey might eat more varied, abundant food than his counterpart in a struggling English house, despite following ostensibly the same rule. This created perception that some communities were faithful while others were corrupt, when often the difference was just economics. Visitation reports when bishops or order officials inspected monasteries reveal the tensions. Visitors would find meat eaten too frequently, portions too large, wine too generous, feast days too numerous. They'd issue corrections. The monastery would comply temporarily, then drift back once oversight left. The cycle repeated endlessly. Inspection, reform, drift, inspection. Genuine change was rare because the communities resisted it, and inspectors lacked enforcement mechanisms. Some monks were genuinely conflicted. They'd taken vows of poverty but lived in communities with substantial resources. They wanted to follow the rule but found its strictness genuinely difficult. They saw the hypocrisy but also understood the practical pressures. These monks existed in perpetual moral discomfort, trying to navigate between ideals and reality, usually settling for compromises that satisfied neither fully. Others felt no conflict whatsoever. They'd entered monasteries for stability, community, and relative comfort compared to peasant life. The religious elements were real but secondary to the practical benefits. These monks saw generous meals as earned perks, not violations. They'd committed to a lifestyle, and if that lifestyle evolved toward greater comfort, well, that was just natural development. The dissolution of monasteries in England, starting 1536, later elsewhere during the Reformation, partially resulted from this perceived corruption. Reformers pointed to wealthy monks living comfortably while claiming poverty as evidence the system was broken. The criticism wasn't entirely fair. Many monasteries maintained genuine discipline, but enough corruption existed to make the accusations stick politically. You're sitting in chapter the weekly meeting where discipline is enforced and community issues are discussed. The abbot is addressing complaints that his private meals contradict the rule. He explains at length how his obligations require hosting guests, how those guests expect appropriate hospitality, how he's serving the monastery's interest by maintaining good relations with patrons. Everything he says is technically true, and also a comfortable rationalization for eating better than everyone else. Around you, brothers react differently. Some nod, they accept the logic, or they don't care, or they've given up fighting. Others stare at the floor, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge authority. A few look genuinely angry, but they stay silent because speaking against the abbot invites consequences. You're not sure what you feel, resentful maybe, but also aware that the monastery's wealth comes from those patron relationships, that without them the community would struggle, that the abbot's private meals might be the price of everyone else's daily bread. The meeting ends, you file out. Dinner waits pottage as always. In the abbot's quarters something better is being prepared. You know this. Everyone knows this. No one says it aloud. The gap between ideal and reality persists. You live in it. So does everyone else. The monastery continues imperfect but functional, corrupt but prayerful, compromised but surviving, which might be the most honest version of monastic life that ever existed. The end came gradually, in some places catastrophically in others, but everywhere it came, and with it the 1,000-year-old monastic food culture dissolved into history. Henry VIII's dissolution of English monasteries starting in 1536 was most dramatic. Within a few years, hundreds of communities scattered, their kitchens went cold, their brewhouses silent, their fish ponds drained. The Reformation spread the destruction across northern Europe. even where monasteries survived, the medieval world that had sustained them was transforming into something they no longer recognised. The English dissolution was brutal and thorough. Commissioners arrived, inventoried everything, assessed the monastery's wealth, then expelled the monks. Some brothers received small pensions, others simply scattered, suddenly released from vows they'd expected to keep for life. The kitchens that had produced pottage for centuries served their last meals. The refectories that had enforced silence for generations echoed empty. The carefully maintained food systems, gardens, fish ponds, mills, brewhouses were seized by the crown or sold to nobles who had no interest in perpetuating them. The physical infrastructure often survived while the culture died. The buildings became country houses, their refectories converted to dining halls where meat appeared at every meal. The fish ponds became ornamental features. The gardens grew flowers instead of vegetables and medicinal herbs. The brewing equipment was sold or destroyed. Everything that had sustained monastic life was repurposed for secular use, the original meaning erased or forgotten. On the continent, the process was slower but equally terminal for the medieval monastic model. The Reformation eliminated monasteries in Protestant regions entirely. In Catholic areas, reform movements like the Tridentine reforms after the Council of Trent tried to restore discipline, but they were restoring something fundamentally different. Early modern monasticism, more regimented, less embedded in feudal agricultural systems, increasingly separate from the rural communities that had sustained medieval houses. The expertise vanished with staggering speed. The brother who knew exactly when to harvest the fish ponds dead, or dispersed his knowledge unrecorded. The cook who could make pottage from anything gone, his techniques forgotten. The brewmaster with decades of experience scattered to secular life where his skills had no application. The gardener who knew which herbs treated which ailments lost his empirical medical knowledge, dismissed as superstition by the new learning. Some food traditions survived in secularized form. Monastery cheeses continued as commercial products made by farmers using techniques learned from expelled monks. Brewing traditions persisted, some monastery breweries becoming commercial operations. Certain agricultural methods, fish farming, garden layouts, crop rotations spread into general practice, their monastic origins forgotten. But the integrated system where food served both physical and spiritual purposes was irretrievably broken. The libraries were catastrophically damaged. Monasteries had been centres of manuscript preservation, including texts on agriculture, cooking, and medicine. During dissolutions, many manuscripts were destroyed, used as kindling, sold as scrap parchment, or simply left to rot. We lost uncountable recipes, medical texts, agricultural manuals, brewing instructions. What survived did so randomly, rescued by collectors who recognized value others missed. Former monks tried to adapt. Some became parish priests living on tithes and fees, occasionally reminiscing about monastery meals that had seemed inadequate at the time but were reliable and communal. Others married, entered trades, or lived on pensions that barely covered basic needs. A few starved. Many died within years of dissolution, their health compromised by decades of marginal nutrition and the sudden stress of adapting to entirely new lives. The poor suffered too. Monasteries had been social safety nets, providing alms, operating infirmaries, offering emergency food during famines. With monasteries gone, those services largely disappeared. Historians still argue about whether the dissolution increased poverty and suffering, but evidence suggests it did. The systems that replaced monasteries were slower to develop and less comprehensive. The landscape changed. Monastic granges, outlying farms were absorbed into secular estates. The carefully managed forests became hunting preserves for nobles. The fish ponds silted up or were drained for farmland. The mills changed ownership. The gardens were ploughed under or redesigned for aesthetic rather than practical purposes. Within a generation, the physical evidence of monastic food production was fading. Some communities survived in modified form. Continental monasteries that weathered the Reformation continued, but their relationship to food was increasingly different. They purchased more, grew less. They relied on markets rather than self-sufficiency. They ate more like surrounding populations, less like their medieval predecessors. The distinctive monastic diet product of Benedict's rule, filtered through 1,000 years of interpretation, gradually homogenized with broader food culture. A few houses maintained continuity that is genuinely remarkable. Some Benedictine communities in southern Europe trace their existence through the upheavals, claiming unbroken lineage to medieval foundations. Whether their current food practices resemble medieval ones is debatable, probably not, but the bread and wine still flow, the refectory bell still rings, and someone still reads aloud during meals in communities that have done so for a millennium. The Trappists, Reformed Cistercians who emerged in the 17th century, attempted to recover medieval austerity, and in some ways succeeded. Modern Trappist monasteries maintain stricter dietary practices than most medieval houses probably did by the late medieval period. They brew beer using techniques that would be recognizable to 12th century monks. They garden, bake, and live in intentional simplicity that echoes, if not perfectly replicates, medieval monastic food culture. But the context is irrecoverably different. Modern Trappists choose monasticism in a world of abundance. Medieval monks chose it in a world of scarcity. The meaning of fasting changes when the alternative is supermarkets versus starvation. The discipline of limited meals means something different when your contemporaries are choosing from restaurant menus versus hoping their one daily meal arrives. The symbolic weight is similar. The lived reality is incomparable. Historians piecing together medieval monastic food culture work from fragments, account books, letters, rules, architectural remains, pollen analysis of fish pond sediments, isotope analysis of monk skeletons. Each piece adds detail, but the complete picture remains elusive. We know what they ate more or less. We can estimate quantities and nutrients. But the experience, the sensory reality, the emotional weight, the spiritual meaning of daily pottage that's harder to recover. The ironies are abundant. Monasteries that claimed poverty accumulated wealth. Monks who renounced pleasure developed sophisticated culinary cultures. Communities devoted to prayer spent enormous energy on food production and management. Rules intended to create uniformity generated spectacular diversity. Restrictions meant to simplify life created elaborate complications. Every contradiction was real, and all of them somehow coexisted for centuries. The dissolution revealed the system's fragility. Something that seemed permanent monasteries had existed for 1,000 years, surely they'd exist for another 1,000, vanished in decades. The food culture that sustained them, complex, sophisticated, deeply integrated with landscape and liturgy, proved dependent on structures that could be dismantled by political decisions. When the framework collapsed, the culture couldn't survive independently. You're standing in what was once a monastery now, centuries after dissolution. The buildings are ruins or have been converted to other purposes. You're trying to imagine the refectory full of brothers, the kitchen producing endless pottage, the garden growing vegetables and medicine simultaneously, the fish ponds teeming, the brewery working constantly. The traces are visible if you know where to look. Foundation stones, altered doorways, the outline of a fish pond now dry. But the life is gone. The bells don't ring for none. No one files silently to dinner. The pottage pot is cold broken or displayed in a museum. The bread ovens crumbled centuries ago. The brothers who knew this life as their daily reality are dust, their memories lost their discipline and hunger, and occasional feast days all equally forgotten. What remains are records, ruins, and questions. What did it feel like to live that way? Was it mostly suffering or mostly meaning? Did the hunger become familiar or always painful? Were feast days genuinely joyful, or just brief relief from grinding deprivation? We can't ask them. They're gone. The monasteries are gone. The food culture is gone. All that's left is this attempt to reconstruct experience from evidence to imagine hunger, from account books to taste pottage from recipes, to feel what it meant to be perpetually somewhat hungry, in service of something you believed was infinitely more important than being full. The wind moves through the ruins. Somewhere in the overgrown garden area, herbs that monks planted centuries ago might still grow wild now their medicinal purposes forgotten. The fish pond is a depression in the ground. The refectory is roofless. The kitchen is foundation stones. But for a moment, if you close your eyes, you can almost smell the pottage, almost hear the silence, almost feel the hunger, almost. The monks ate and prayed and died. The food sustained them, restricted them, shaped them. It was never just food, it was theology, discipline, survival, and community, all stirred together in a pot that never quite emptied, until finally it did. The system ended, the culture dissolved, the knowledge scattered. But for 1,000 years men ate pottage and bread and called it holy. And maybe in its way it was. The night is deep now. The history has settled around you like dust on old stones. You've walked through centuries of hunger and discipline, feast and fast rules and loopholes, gardens and fish ponds, bread and beer, and the endless patient endurance of men who ate just enough to keep praying. The monastic refectories are empty now and have been for centuries, but tonight you've sat in them. You've tasted their pottage, even if only in imagination. You've felt their hunger, understood their compromises, witnessed their attempts to honour both body and soul with the same meal. Sleep comes easier now with the weight of all the history settled. Tomorrow you'll wake to a different world, one with choices abundance, and the strange luxury of eating without restriction. But tonight you've lived briefly as they lived, simply, disciplinedly, hungrily, hopefully. The bells have rung for Compline, the final service. The brothers have filed to their cells. The kitchen is dark. The refectory waits for tomorrow's meal. And you, distant by centuries but close by imagination, can finally rest too. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.